I arrived at the property just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. The road had been long and empty, winding through fields that seemed to stretch forever, and when I finally reached the gate, the world felt quieter than it should have been. There was a small sign, barely legible in the fading light, warning visitors of private property. Beyond it, the main house stood in silence, its windows dark and blank, like eyes that had long forgotten how to see. I parked my car and stepped out, the tires crunching softly on the gravel. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and decaying leaves. Already, I could feel the tension settling over me like a thin, heavy blanket. This was not my usual line of work, and I knew it. I had agreed to the caretaker job for a few nights because the owners were away and wanted someone to check in, ensure that the place was secure. It seemed simple enough in theory. Walk the grounds, inspect the house, keep a log. But as I approached the porch, something about the stillness made my stomach tight. The air was too quiet, almost deliberate in its silence, as if it were holding its breath and waiting. I brushed the thought away, convincing myself I was just tired from the drive. The door was unlocked, though the lock looked old and rusted. I pushed it open slowly, and the wooden floor groaned beneath my weight. Inside, the house smelled of dust and something faintly metallic, like old water or iron. It was dim, the last light of day filtering through the grimy windows, throwing weak, slanting shadows across the walls. I set my bag down and began to look around. The furniture was sparse but intact, covered in sheets that had yellowed with age. Plates were stacked in the kitchen, some chipped, some coated with a thin film of dust. Everything seemed untouched, frozen in time, and yet I felt vaguely that I was not alone. I moved carefully through the living room, noting the scattered belongings. A few books had toppled over near the fireplace, their pages yellowed and curling. I picked one up, running my fingers over the cracked spine. It was a diary, or at least it seemed like one. The handwriting inside was neat but tense, the kind of careful script that suggested someone had been trying to record their thoughts under pressure. I flipped through a few pages, but the words were fragmented, disjointed, a mix of daily chores and something more. A worry, a fear, though I could not quite place what. I put it back, quietly, as if even touching it might awaken something. The kitchen, with its faint smell of old food and rust, drew my attention next. Cups lined the shelf, covered in a thin layer of dust, and the sink had a few stains from water long gone. I washed my hands slowly, enjoying the cold touch of the tap, and for a moment the ordinary routine of cleaning, of preparing, grounded me. Outside, the wind moved the branches of nearby trees, scratching softly against the windows. I paused to listen, and it was almost hypnotic, the way the sound drifted in, as if the house itself was breathing, slowly, deliberately. I decided to inspect the bedrooms next. The first one I entered had a large bed covered in a white sheet, its outline sagging in the middle. The room smelled faintly of mildew and something else, something sweet but cloying, like old perfume left to linger. On the dresser, a small photograph leaned against a mirror, half covered in dust. I wiped it gently, revealing a woman's face, smiling softly, though her eyes seemed distant, empty almost. I wondered who she was, what had become of her. The thought was fleeting, like a shadow, and yet it lingered longer than it should. As the sun dipped completely below the horizon, darkness crept into every corner. The house grew colder, the air thickening in a way that made my chest feel tight. I lit a small lamp, the soft glow spreading just enough light to keep the shadows from fully consuming the room. I moved from room to room, checking doors and windows, noting the sound of my own footsteps echoing unnaturally in the empty hallways. Sometimes, in that quiet, I thought I heard a soft creak or sigh from another floor, but when I paused and listened, there was nothing, just the wind outside and the house settling around me. I set up my small workstation in the study, a notebook, a pen, a flashlight, and a thermos of coffee. I made a small log of the evening. Arrived, house appears intact, minor dust and debris, no immediate hazards. The act of writing felt reassuring, grounding. I sipped my coffee and listened to the night. Outside, an owl called once, then silence. Then again. The rhythm was calm, almost meditative, and I allowed myself to settle, letting the quiet wrap around me. Hours passed slowly. I found myself wandering the house again, drawn to the creaking floorboards and the faint drafts of air moving through the cracks. Sometimes I caught glimpses of movement in the corner of my eye, but when I turned, there was nothing. I told myself it was fatigue, the long drive, the isolation. I was alone here, and yet the house felt almost aware of me. I could sense it in the way the shadows shifted, the way the wind seemed to whisper through the walls. I paused by the window overlooking the back garden. The trees swayed gently, their branches scraping softly against each other, and I noticed the faint outline of a shed I hadn't seen before. Or perhaps it had always been there. It was difficult to tell, because the night made everything both clearer and more ambiguous. I strained my eyes but could see nothing moving. I tried to remind myself that I was just tired, that the mind played tricks when left in silence too long. Later, I explored the basement. The stairs were narrow and steep, and the air grew colder the further down I went. Dust motes floated in the weak light of my flashlight, and the faint smell of damp stone and mildew filled my nose. I moved slowly, careful not to disturb anything, and noticed the remnants of old furniture stacked haphazardly. There were boxes, some broken open, their contents spilling across the floor. Clothes, letters, small personal items left to rot. I could almost feel the history pressing against me, the lives that had once been here, their presence lingering in the air like a memory I couldn't quite reach. By the time I returned upstairs, the house was utterly silent. My footsteps sounded impossibly loud in the empty halls. I sat back in the study, notebook in hand, and tried to write down the sensations of the evening, but words felt inadequate. The emptiness was too full, the silence too heavy. And somewhere far away, or perhaps close, I thought I heard a whisper. Faint, almost imperceptible, like a sigh carried on the wind through the cracks of the old wooden walls. I held my breath, waited, and the sound vanished. I made a note to myself. First night, house intact, no visible threats, strange atmosphere, unsettling quiet, proceed with caution. I sipped the last of my coffee, letting the warmth spread through me. The lamp flickered once and I paused, staring at it. Then it stabilized and the shadows remained calm. I knew I would not sleep well tonight, if at all. The house seemed to breathe around me, and I felt that it had watched my every step since I arrived. Still, I told myself I was safe, that there was nothing supernatural, that the emptiness, the dust, the silence were simply the results of time and neglect. And yet, deep down, I could not shake the feeling that I had crossed an invisible threshold the moment I stepped inside. I took a deep breath, letting my shoulders relax just enough to feel the creeping weight of the night pressing in. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, the branches scraping softly against each other. The house was quiet but not silent, and as I closed my eyes, I felt it, the awareness, subtle and patient, watching me, waiting for me to drift into sleep. I could feel it the moment I stepped into the hallway that led to the old study. There was something about the door at the far end, its dark wood polished by time yet coated in a thin film of dust that seemed untouched for decades. The brass knob had dulled with age, and the lock, though rusty, was still solid. I had noticed it during the first walkthrough earlier that evening, but I hadn't thought much of it. Now, in the silence of the night, it felt alive, as if the room itself were breathing, waiting. I paused outside the door, leaning slightly on the frame. The house was quiet but not silent. The wind whispered outside, moving the branches of the tall pines that pressed close against the windows. Somewhere far off, a loose shutter banged softly, a hollow sound that echoed through the empty halls. And then there it was, something else. A faint, irregular noise from behind the study door. Not a creak from the hinges, not the house settling. It was softer than that, almost a sigh. As though someone had exhaled slowly, deliberately on the other side. I swallowed hard. My first instinct was to leave it alone, to dismiss it as my imagination. But something drew me forward. Curiosity, or perhaps a sense that the room demanded attention. My hand rested on the doorknob, cold against my palm. I tried to remember the rules, check, log, observe. Nothing about opening a locked room in the dead of night. But the sound came again, a faint scuffing, almost like the drag of a chair across the floor, deliberate, slow. My heart tightened, but I turned the knob anyway. The door resisted at first, stiff with rust, but after a few tries it creaked open. The hinges groaned, announcing my intrusion into a room that clearly hadn't been entered for a long time. A stale, musty smell hit me immediately, a mix of old paper, mildew, and something else. Something I couldn't identify but felt like it should not be there. The lamp I had brought from the study flickered slightly, and I adjusted it, letting the soft yellow light fall over the threshold. Inside, the room was smaller than I had imagined, cramped and lined with shelves full of books that were thick with dust. The air was heavy and still, almost solid, and each breath I took seemed to stir 1,000 tiny particles. A large desk sat in the center, its surface covered in papers yellowed with age. I stepped inside cautiously, each footfall louder than I expected, echoing softly off the walls. The noise behind me, the sigh, the scuffing, was gone, replaced by an oppressive stillness that pressed in on me from every side. I moved to the desk, brushing my fingers over the papers. Most were ledgers, small journals, or letters carefully stacked. Some pages had faded into illegibility, others were brittle, crumbling under the lightest touch. I began reading, trying to ground myself in the mundane, the ordinary. At first, the entries were dull, almost clinical, notes about maintenance, minor repairs, purchases. But as I skimmed further, a different tone emerged, one that spoke of fear, of secrecy. Names were listed, addresses crossed out, mentions of people who had come and gone. There were references to the house itself, its history, and a vague unease that seemed to grow heavier with each line. I paused, suddenly aware of the quiet again, the kind that presses against the ears and makes the heart beat louder than normal. The window blinds rattled softly in the wind, and for a fleeting moment I thought I saw a shadow move across the far corner of the room. I turned sharply, but nothing was there. I told myself it was the light, a trick of the lamp, my mind reaching for shapes in the darkness. Still, the feeling lingered, a sense that the room was not quite empty, that the air itself held something, some presence that could not be seen but could be felt. On the wall, an old painting caught my attention. It was a portrait of a man, seated at a desk very much like the one in the room. His eyes, painted dark and deep, seemed to follow me as I moved. I moved closer, squinting at the brushstrokes, the way the shadows had been captured. There was a detail that unsettled me. The corner of a page in the painted desk was turned as if someone had just read it. A small, almost imperceptible crease, but enough to make me step back. The room felt colder now, as if the act of noticing it had drawn the air tighter around me. I explored the shelves, running my fingers over the spines of books that had not been opened in decades. Some were thick tomes of law or accountancy, others were novels, fiction of a kind that seemed ordinary but felt oddly chosen. I pulled one at random, a faded leather-bound journal. Its pages were covered in dense handwriting, spiraling thoughts that grew more anxious as the entries continued. At first, it seemed like worry over daily life, repairs, finances, minor accidents, but then the tone changed. The writer began noting sounds, movements, shadows that they could not explain, a fear of being watched, and finally a name. Or perhaps it was a phrase scribbled hastily at the bottom of one page: "They never leave." I put the book down carefully, my hands trembling slightly. The room seemed quieter now, but it was a false quiet, a quiet that pressed on my ears and filled the spaces between heartbeats. I looked around, trying to see if I had missed anything. The corner of the room opposite the door held a small cabinet, its door slightly ajar. Inside were papers, documents, and small objects that suggested private, personal use. Photographs, a broken watch, a key without an obvious lock. Items left behind in a hurry, or left deliberately. I couldn't tell. I felt a flicker of unease, the sensation that I was not just observing history but trespassing into it. And then it happened. A soft noise, almost imperceptible, a scratch or a scrape from the far side of the room. I froze, holding my breath, listening. Nothing. And then again, a little louder this time, followed by a faint thump like something falling over lightly, but enough to echo in the tight space. I told myself it was the house settling, the wind moving through the cracks. But I could not shake the sensation that I was being watched, that the room had held its breath until I noticed the painting, until I touched the journals, until I reached the cabinet. I moved toward the door slowly, each step deliberate. The air felt heavier with every inch, almost viscous, and my hands brushed over the walls for balance. When I reached the threshold, I turned back, letting my eyes sweep over the room one last time. Shadows seemed to gather in the corners, soft, curling, almost alive. The desk, the books, the painting, they were all the same, unchanged, yet somehow different, charged, waiting. I stepped out of the study and closed the door behind me. The lock clicked shut with a sound that resonated in my chest more than it should have. I leaned against the door, breathing slowly, trying to calm the pulse in my ears. The hallway was still, the house silent, but the study remained. I could feel it beyond the wood and lock, watching, waiting. The papers, the journals, the whispered thoughts of someone long gone, they lingered, and I knew somehow that the room would not let me forget it. I returned to the study in my mind often that night, sitting in the corner of my small workstation, sipping coffee and listening to the wind against the windows. Every creak, every sigh of the old house seemed to echo from that locked room, reminding me of its presence. I could not stop thinking about the journals, the painting, the phrase written in haste. They never leave. I did not know who they were, and I did not know if it referred to the previous occupant, the house itself, or something else entirely. By the time I finally allowed myself to sit quietly and close my eyes, the image of the study pressed behind my eyelids, shadows stretching along the walls, books stacked and waiting. The house was silent, but it was a false silence, one that hinted at secrets that had been left behind, waiting for someone curious or foolish enough to notice them. I knew, as sleep tugged at me reluctantly, that I would return to that room. Not tonight, perhaps, but soon. There was something there, something I had glimpsed only briefly, and it would not let me rest until I understood what had been left behind. I had settled into a routine by the second night, or at least I tried to convince myself that I had. The house, which had seemed almost passive on the first evening, now felt alert in a way that was almost predatory. It moved around me quietly, subtly. I noticed it first when I walked through the living room and felt a sudden chill press against my skin, a cold spot that seemed to linger in one corner like a presence rather than a draft. I stopped, waited, and listened. The house was silent. Yet the air felt heavier there, denser, as if breathing was somehow more difficult. I turned slowly, scanning the room. Nothing had changed, no open windows, no obvious source of the cold, but the sensation did not dissipate. I walked through the space again, each step careful, deliberate, as though I were negotiating with some invisible boundary. By now, I had begun to notice other things too. A chair slightly out of place from where I remembered it. A book on the floor that I was certain I had stacked neatly. Small movements, subtle enough to dismiss if I wanted to, yet impossible to ignore when I paused long enough to notice them. That night I decided to keep a meticulous record in my log. The first entry was mundane. Checked the house, ensured doors were locked, no intruders, temperature steady. But as the night deepened, I found myself noting other things. The way shadows seemed to stretch across walls even when the lamp cast a consistent glow. The faint sound of whispers that drifted through the halls, soft enough that I could not make out words. They were not voices I recognized, but they had a cadence, a rhythm that felt almost human. My own breathing seemed loud in comparison, and I began to question whether the noises were real or conjured by fatigue and isolation. I made my way to the study again. The locked room from the night before seemed to call to me, its door closed, the lock secure, but the air around it tingled in a way that demanded attention. I placed my hand on the doorknob, and the chill that had haunted the living room was here too, creeping up my arm, making the hair on my forearm stand on end. I hesitated. Then, almost without thinking, I returned to my notebook, documenting the sensation rather than confronting it. I could feel my own heartbeat rising as I wrote, slow but insistent. The wind outside rattled a window pane, small and irregular, and for a moment it sounded like a sigh or a breath coming from inside the house itself. Around midnight, the objects in the house began to shift more noticeably. It started with a book on the coffee table in the living room. I had left it stacked neatly with three others. When I returned, it was lying flat, a few inches from its original position. I chalked it up to the house settling, or perhaps my memory playing tricks, but then it happened again. A pen rolled off my desk in the study, despite being in the center of a smooth, clean surface. I picked it up, shook my head, and tried to ignore it, yet the weight of the uncanny began to press down on me. I realized with a sudden, uncomfortable awareness that the house was not passive anymore. It was observing, responding. The whispers came back, this time more distinct. I sat in the study trying to focus on my notebook, but I could hear the soft, raspy murmur of something just beyond comprehension. I strained to catch a word, a phrase, anything intelligible, but all I received was the sensation of presence, the unmistakable awareness that something unseen was close, moving, aware of my every gesture. I tried talking aloud, reasoning with myself. It's the wind. It's the house settling. It's fatigue. But even as I spoke, I realized the sound of my own voice felt hollow, echoed oddly, as though the house had absorbed it and returned a distorted version. At one point, I thought I saw movement in the corner of the hallway. I froze, holding my breath, staring into the dim light that barely reached the far wall. There was nothing, at least nothing I could identify, but a sensation lingered like a hand had brushed against the back of my neck. I turned slowly in a complete circle, but no one was there. The hair on my arms and neck remained standing, prickling with a tension that would not fade. I forced myself to continue writing, documenting every subtle change, every odd sensation, as if the act of recording it could somehow anchor me to reality. The night stretched onward. Every creak of the floor, every faint shift of wind, every irregular shadow became magnified in the quiet. I walked through the house repeatedly, checking doors, inspecting windows, confirming that nothing was missing. Nothing had moved in a way I could verify. And yet the feeling of movement persisted. Chairs tilted slightly, books shifted, even the curtains by the main window seemed to twitch as if some unseen hand had brushed them. I was meticulous, trying to ensure that my mind was not playing tricks, but the evidence, small as it was, continued to mount. I found myself returning to the locked study in my mind, imagining the air beyond the door thick with anticipation. I wondered if the faint noises, the whispers, the moving objects were connected to what had once been kept inside that room. Was it the previous occupant, some fragment of life long past, or was it something else entirely, a presence left behind by the weight of history itself? I could not answer, and that uncertainty gnawed at me as the hours crawled past. Around 2 a.m, I noticed the cold spots again. They appeared without warning, not confined to corners or drafts, but in the middle of rooms, shifting from one place to another. My breath would fog in the air even without visible chill. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to generate warmth, but the sensation persisted, a creeping frost that moved in tandem with my awareness. I stopped, closed my eyes, and focused on writing. My handwriting grew shaky as my mind tried to reconcile the ordinary with the inexplicable. The whispers became insistent at times, but never clear. I could not distinguish words, only cadence, a rhythm that suggested a dialogue just beyond reach. I tried speaking to it. I am alone. I am not here to harm. But the sound of my own voice did not seem to satisfy it. There was no anger, no malice, only a patient, waiting quality that made me feel simultaneously insignificant and observed in a way that was impossible to escape. Objects continued to shift. A small jar of screws moved several inches across the workbench in the study. I reached out to pick it up, but before I could, it shifted again, as if nudged by invisible fingers. My heart pounded in response, slow and steady, and I forced myself to breathe deeply, counting each inhale and exhale, grounding myself. I reminded myself that fatigue and isolation could do strange things to perception, that shadows could stretch in unnatural ways, that the mind could fill silence with sound. And yet, I could not dismiss what I had felt, what I had seen. By the early hours of morning, I sat back in my chair, notebook open, recording the final entries of the night. My hands shook slightly from exhaustion, from tension, from the inexplicable accumulation of small, unnerving occurrences. I tried to summarize to give myself some sense of closure. Unexplained noises, cold spots, objects shift without cause, whispers unintelligible, persistent, house aware, must remain vigilant. I paused, staring at the page. Even writing it down did not lessen the weight of reality pressing around me. And then it happened. A whisper closer than ever, almost at my ear, and yet no one was there. I froze, pencil hovering, and the room seemed to inhale. My vision blurred slightly with tension. I could feel the air moving in waves, subtle but unmistakable. My own heartbeat sounded loud in my ears, quick and irregular. I could not move, could not speak, could not close my eyes. And then, just as abruptly as it had arrived, the sensation receded, leaving me with a silence that felt charged, like a quiet before some impossible event. I wrote one last line in my notebook. They are here, watching, waiting. I set the pencil down and leaned back, unable to continue. My thoughts faltered, my focus splintered. I could not reconcile the ordinary with the inexplicable. The room, the house, the objects, the whispers, they were all part of something beyond my comprehension. I knew I would return tomorrow, that I could not leave, not yet. But I also knew that the story, the journal, the house, my own awareness, remained unresolved, suspended in a liminal space between what was real and what could not be explained. I left the notebook open on the desk, as if leaving a door ajar for someone else to understand, or perhaps for myself to continue in the future. The house remained silent, the cold spots gone for the moment, the shadows still and deep. And yet I could feel the presence lingering, patient and subtle, waiting for my next night on duty, ready to remind me that even in emptiness, the house was never truly empty. I climbed the stairs to the bedroom for a few hours of restless, uneasy sleep, the whispers fading but never gone entirely, the movement of objects and the sense of watchfulness embedded in every corner of the house. I drifted in and out of awareness, caught between reality and imagination, between exhaustion and alertness. The journal remained open on the desk, a silent witness to the night's events, and I knew that what had begun would continue, unresolved, into the nights that followed. I had been driving along the forest road for hours, the headlights cutting narrow paths through the dense pines. The night was quiet in a way that felt unnatural, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes every little sound seem amplified. My old pickup groaned over roots and gravel, each bump echoing in the still air, and I welcomed the ordinary noises because they reminded me that I was alive, moving, present. I hadn't intended to stay out this late. I'd been chasing the signal for days, a faint ham radio transmission that flickered in and out, always just out of reach, always crackling like a whisper through static. When I finally stopped at a clearing, I cut the engine and sat in silence. The forest pressed around me, shadows pooling beneath the trees, dark and deep. I turned on my portable ham radio, the little device humming to life in my hands. Static hissed and whispered. And then just for a moment, I heard it. A voice, soft, weak, overlaid with the constant buzz of interference. It said something I couldn't understand, fragmented words that drifted through the white noise, and then it was gone again. My pulse quickened. I leaned closer, adjusting the dial slowly, trying not to rush, trying not to disturb the fragile thread of connection. The forest seemed to hold its breath while I worked. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me startle, though I knew I was alone. Still, the voice returned, this time slightly clearer, though still wrapped in static. There was urgency in it, a strain I could not place. I could hear someone calling, or maybe trying to call, someone reaching out through the crackling airwaves, tethered to this place by some unseen thread. My hand shook slightly as I adjusted the frequency, listening, hopping, afraid to make a sound. I knew that the signal came from somewhere nearby. I could feel it in the way the static thickened when I moved closer to the tree line and thinned when I stepped back into the clearing. It wasn't precise, but it was enough to guide me. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the truck, the cold night air brushing against my face, making my skin prickle. I walked slowly, deliberately, each step measured. The forest was dark, almost absolute, and the beam of my flashlight seemed swallowed by the towering trunks. The voice came again, faint and trembling, like a fragile thread that could snap at any moment. The closer I moved to the signal, the more the forest seemed alive. The branches above me creaked as though whispering among themselves. Shadows pooled and shifted around me, and I could not tell if they were the result of the uneven ground and my light or something else entirely. I forced myself to breathe steadily, counting each step to keep my mind tethered to reality. The voice spoke again, fragmented words, indistinct syllables. I caught help once, or thought I did, and my heart ached with a mix of fear and urgency. Someone somewhere might be trapped. Eventually, I stumbled into a small clearing, just large enough to see a structure partially hidden among the trees. It was a cabin, old and abandoned, with shingles missing, the roof sagging in places. The windows were dark and dull, reflecting only the thin slice of moonlight that fell across the clearing. The ham radio in my hand crackled again, a soft, static-laced voice almost pleading, almost guiding me closer. I could hear it clearer now. Not words exactly, but inflections, patterns in the static, like a rhythm trying to find form. I approached slowly, the flashlight in one hand, the radio in the other. The air smelled of damp wood and rock. The forest seemed to pause around me, leaves still, wind stilled as though holding its breath. The cabin was small, a single room, nothing more than a frame of old timber and broken shingles. And yet, even from outside, I could feel it, an almost tangible weight, the sense that something had been waiting here, or perhaps had never left. The radio's voice was soft, insistent, and I could not shake the thought that it came from inside the cabin, though I had no way to know for sure. I moved closer to the door, brushing my hand against the wood. The surface was rough, splintered, and the hinges creaked faintly when I nudged it. The voice came again, and this time I thought I heard a word clearly: please. My chest tightened. I set the radio down carefully, holding the flashlight high to illuminate the interior. The inside was empty, at least at first glance, but the air felt charged, like it carried the memory of someone who had been there very recently, or someone who had never left. I stepped inside cautiously. The floorboards were warped and rotted in places, but solid enough to hold me. Dust motes floated in the beam of my flashlight, catching the faint moonlight. The cabin smelled old and decayed, but underneath that was a faint trace of something else, something organic, something human. I could not tell if it was fear or sweat, or simply the remnants of someone long gone. I swept my light across the walls, noting the remnants of furniture. A collapsed chair, a broken table, papers strewn across the floor. None of it seemed recent, but the voice continued to drift from the radio in my hands, insistently, painfully human. I knelt to examine the papers, some of them faded and water-stained. They were letters or journal pages, fragments of thoughts written in a hurried, slanting hand. I could not make sense of them entirely. There were names, dates, mentions of the forest and the cabin, worries about being alone, fears about things in the dark. The more I read, the more I felt the weight of someone's presence pressing into my awareness. The voice from the radio seemed closer now, layered with static but unmistakably human. Someone had been trapped, someone had needed help, and perhaps still did. I moved to the far corner of the cabin. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally there, curling and pooling where the light did not reach. My hand brushed against the wall and I froze. There was a draft or a movement, I could not tell. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was fatigue, nerves, the long hours of tracking the signal. But the radio crackled again, the voice insistent. I could not understand the words fully, just a sense of urgency, a plea threaded through the static. It made my stomach knot. I wanted to leave, but something compelled me to stay, to listen, to understand. The night pressed in around me, long and silent except for the faint, rhythmic crackle of the radio. Outside, the trees shifted gently in the wind, scratching against each other in soft, eerie percussion. Inside, the cabin held its secrets close, its history heavy in the air. The voice whispered again, softer this time, almost intimate, as though it could feel my presence. I could not discern a face, a shape, only the sense of someone waiting, someone trapped in memory or in space, calling across the static for help that might never come. Hours passed in a kind of suspended time. I moved slowly through the cabin, examining the remnants of life left behind, the furniture, the scattered papers, the faint stains on the floor that suggested someone had been here not entirely by accident. The radio hissed quietly beside me, a lifeline and a tether, but the voice grew fainter, as if tired, fatting, withdrawing. I realized that I would not leave the cabin understanding anything fully, that the voice was both guidance and warning, leading me deeper into the forest of someone else's fear, someone else's isolation. I stepped outside again, the cold night air sharp against my cheeks, and held the radio close. The voice came once more, softer now, almost like a sigh, a final plea that I could not interpret. I shivered, the forest seeming larger, older, aware of my intrusion. I walked back to my truck slowly, the path illuminated only by my flashlight and the weak moonlight, the trees looming silently, pressing close. I did not turn back to the cabin. I could feel it in my bones. That presence lingered, patient and not entirely gone. As I drove away, the radio's voice faded into static, indistinct yet unforgettable. The forest stretched endlessly on either side, dark and silent, holding its secrets as I left. I could not stop thinking about the cabin, about the person, or people, who had once been trapped, about the faint, desperate hope embedded in the radio signal. It was a night that would remain in my mind long after the forest disappeared behind me, a memory of static and shadow, of a voice calling out from somewhere just beyond reach, asking for something I could not fully give. I could still hear the faint crackle of the radio in my hand as I moved deeper into the forest. The night had grown colder, the mist rising from the ground in thin, curling tendrils that clung to my boots and ankles. The light from my flashlight barely pierced the haze, illuminating only a few feet ahead. Every step felt deliberate, measured, as though the forest itself demanded caution. The voice from the radio was weaker now, fragmented, a soft pulse of static and sound, like someone whispering just beyond comprehension. It called to me without urgency, almost gently, yet impossible to ignore. The trail I had been following faded as the mist thickened. The familiar crunch of gravel beneath my feet gave way to soft earth and fallen leaves. The air smelled damp, heavy with the decay of pine needles and rotting wood. I adjusted the radio, fine-tuning the dial, listening. There, through the static, a pattern emerged. A voice, or the impression of one, rising and falling with the hiss of the signal, guiding me. My pulse quickened, though I tried to slow my breathing. Step by step, I moved forward, drawn by the fragile thread of sound that promised something, someone. The forest around me felt alive in subtle ways. Branches brushed against each other, producing soft, rhythmic noises that echoed in the mist. Occasionally, I thought I saw shapes in the fog, shadows that moved at the periphery of my vision. I would freeze, heart thudding, only to realize it was the trees themselves, swaying, bending, indifferent to my presence. Still, I could not shake the sense of being watched. The radio continued its static-laced murmur, and I followed it as though compelled by some instinct I did not understand. After what felt like hours, the terrain began to change. The ground became uneven, roots snaking across the path like dark veins. I stumbled once, catching myself on a moss-covered rock. The mist swirled around me, curling like smoke, and I realized I could no longer see the outline of my truck behind me. The forest was total, the darkness complete, and I felt a strange mixture of isolation and anticipation. The voice from the radio grew slightly clearer, almost forming words I could not yet understand, drawing me further. Eventually, I stumbled upon what seemed to be a trail, barely discernible under years of neglect. It was overgrown, the remnants of old footprints and tire tracks fading into the earth. The mist clung to the ground, dampening sound, softening the echo of my boots. I followed it slowly, cautiously, noticing the foundations of old cabins emerging from the haze. Stone and timber, crumbling and half buried, suggested a settlement long forgotten. Each step brought a faint thrill of discovery tinged with unease. These structures had once been alive with activity. Now, only silence remained, heavy and oppressive. I paused to examine the first foundation I came to. The stones were rough and weathered, arranged in a pattern that suggested a small cabin, long since collapsed. Moss had claimed much of the structure, and the wood had rotted away entirely. I ran my fingers over the cold, rough stone. I could almost imagine the people who had lived here, their lives simple and hard, now erased by time. The forest had swallowed them, and the mist made it feel as if they still lingered in some residual form, their presence stitched into the earth itself. I moved to the next foundation, stepping carefully through underbrush and fallen branches. The fog thickened, curling around my legs, and the radio pulsed softly in my hands, a faint heartbeat of sound guiding me. I thought I heard a whisper in the distance, faint but distinct, a human-sounding exhale riding along with the static. I froze, straining my ears. The mist distorted the sounds, and I could not tell if it was real or imagined, a trick of my mind exhausted by hours in isolation. My pulse raced, but I forced myself to continue, each step slow, deliberate. The foundations grew more numerous, scattered across the clearing like bones of a forgotten village. Some were little more than stones jutting from the earth. Others retained remnants of timber and plaster, charred or waterlogged. I imagined children running between them, voices laughing and fatting into the distance, families cooking over small stoves, and then, slowly, the inevitable decay, the slow encroachment of the forest reclaiming all that had once been. It was a quiet sort of horror, not sudden or violent, but the persistent weight of absence. I stopped by a particularly large foundation, a structure that must have been more significant than the others. The stone walls, though broken, still stood to waist height in places, and I could see the outline of what had been a hearth in the center. I knelt, brushing the moss and leaves aside. The ground around it was soft, but there were depressions, subtle footprints pressed into the earth, old and worn, almost imperceptible. I could feel my chest tighten, a sense of presence pressing into the edges of my awareness. I was not alone, not in a physical sense perhaps, but in the feeling that the space retained memory. The mist swirled thicker now, rising to my knees. The forest beyond the foundation seemed almost unreal, the trees fatting into fog, their trunks ghostly and blurred. The radio pulsed again, faint and rhythmic. I pressed it to my ear. I could hear the voice, clearer this time, a soft, pleading tone threaded through static. It was impossible to understand words fully, yet impossible to ignore. Someone or something was calling, tethered to these ruins, calling for attention, for recognition, for something I could not name. I walked slowly from foundation to foundation, letting the radio guide me, letting the fog and silence shape my path. Every step felt both natural and impossible. The forest pressed in on all sides, dense and still, as if waiting to see what I would do. Branches brushed against my shoulders, leaves soaked me with moisture from the mist, and the smell of damp earth and rot filled my nose. I felt the past of this place in every stone, in every hollowed-out cabin foundation, in every faint depression in the ground where someone had once walked. At one point I thought I heard movement off to my left, a soft scraping sound like someone dragging a foot across the forest floor. I froze, holding my breath, listening. The mist distorted everything. The sound could have been an animal, a falling branch, the wind, but it felt deliberate, patient. I clutched the radio tighter, feeling the weight of it in my hands as though it were a lifeline to the unknown, tethering me to someone or something, still present in the forest. The trail I followed became less clear, scattered by fallen trees and moss-covered stones. I had to duck beneath branches, step carefully over roots, and occasionally retrace my steps to find the faint echoes of the radio signal. It was tiring work, mentally and physically, but I was compelled to continue. There was something there, something that had sent the signal, and I felt that if I did not follow, I might never know what it was. Even if it meant walking into deeper darkness, even if it meant wandering alone among the ruins, I could not stop. By the time I reached what appeared to be the last foundation, the mist had thickened to a near impenetrable fog. The radio pulsed faintly, weaker now, as if the source of the signal were near, yet receding, hesitant. The foundation was small, broken, and almost completely claimed by the forest. Stone walls barely rose above the ground. I knelt, brushing leaves and moss aside, and felt the weight of something buried beneath the soil. Not a body, perhaps, but a presence, a memory, an echo of life that had long since vanished. The forest around me seemed to lean closer, as if curious about my intrusion, as if judging my actions. The voice from the radio pulsed one final time, soft, wavering, almost human. I could not understand words, but I understood intent. A plea, a call for recognition, a tether stretched thin across time and space. I pressed the radio to my chest, feeling a shiver move down my spine. The forest held me, the mist pressed in, and the weight of all the lost lives, all the abandoned cabins, all the forgotten voices pressed against my mind. I knew I would not leave unchanged, that the memory of this hike, of this place, would remain with me, echoing long after I emerged from the fog. I hesitated at the threshold of the cabin. The small structure leaned slightly, its timbers bowed with age, rust creeping along the hinges of the door. A faint, almost metallic scent clung to the air, mingling with the damp odor of the forest. My flashlight cut through the shadows, illuminating patches of warped wood and peeling paint. I could feel my pulse in my throat as I stepped inside, each movement deliberate, careful. The radio, still faintly humming with static in my backpack, felt like a distant heartbeat behind me. The cabin was small, scarcely more than a single room. The floor creaked under my weight, groaning as if protesting my intrusion. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, faded to dull shades of brown and gray. What caught my attention immediately were the symbols, scrawled, scratched, almost carved into the plaster in several places. They were jagged and irregular, repeating in patterns that felt deliberate. I ran my fingers lightly over one of the marks. It was dry, brittle, and left a faint residue on my fingertips. I shivered, though I could not explain why, and took careful notes in my mind. The light from my flashlight danced across the room, revealing remnants of past lives. A table leaned at a precarious angle, a chair lay toppled, and in the corner a small bed frame remained, rusted and hollow. On the table there was a diary, its cover cracked and discolored, pages yellowed with age. I picked it up gingerly. The leather felt thin and fragile, and the spine groaned as I opened it. I could see the handwriting, small and precise at first, then growing more erratic as I turned each page. The diary belonged to someone who had lived here long ago, alone. The entries began with mundane notes, what they had eaten, the weather outside, minor repairs to the cabin. But slowly the tone changed. A subtle unease crept into the words, a growing awareness of isolation. The writer mentioned hearing noises outside, soft scratching at the walls, shadows moving beyond the windows. At first they dismissed these things as animals or the wind, but as time passed the fear became palpable, seeping from every sentence. I felt the unease myself, pressing against my chest as I read. One entry caught my attention. It was written in a hurried scrawl, the ink smeared in places as if the writer had shaken with anxiety. They watch, not the birds, not the forest, but something else, always there just out of sight. I hear them in the walls, I feel them when I sleep. I cannot leave, cannot call, cannot be seen. I am alone and yet not alone. The words made my skin crawl. I lowered the diary, breathing slowly, telling myself it was merely a record of fear, that the writer might have been unwell or overly imaginative. Yet the symbols on the walls, the smell, the cold air, they suggested something else, something lingering in the fabric of the cabin itself. I moved closer to the corner where the symbols were most concentrated. The marks were jagged, repeating, forming patterns I could not understand but felt instinctively significant. Some of them resembled letters, others shapes, like the remnants of some private language. The lines intersected in ways that made no sense to me, but I felt almost physically that they carried intent. The diary, resting in my lap, seemed to confirm it. The writer had noted them, marking them repeatedly, expressing fear, obsession, fascination. I could almost hear the writer's voice echoing through the mist, carried in the whisper of the radio signal. The air in the cabin felt heavier, charged with an almost tangible presence. I could sense it pressing against the corners of the room, threading itself through the broken floorboards, curling around the rusted edges of the bed frame. The diary fell open to another page, the handwriting uneven, trembling. I have tried to speak to them. They answer in whispers, in scratches, in movements that are not mine. I see them when I close my eyes. I know they are there. I swallowed hard. The floorboards groaned again, and a faint shift in the room's shadows made me freeze, listening. I tried to focus, grounding myself in observation. The cabin was abandoned, certainly, the diary old. Yet the sensations, the weight in the air, the pull of the symbols, the faint, almost imperceptible hum of presence, were undeniable. I walked carefully from one wall to another, tracing the symbols with my flashlight, examining the marks. Each seemed deliberate, repeated with intent, almost ritualistic. I felt a connection between them and the diary, as if the person who had lived here had been trying to communicate, to warn, or perhaps to call for someone who could understand. The radio, still humming faintly from my bag, crackled to life, soft static overlaying a sound almost like breathing. I pressed it to my ear. I could hear nothing coherent, only a soft modulation in the static that felt alive, like a whisper teasing the edges of comprehension. My heart thudded. The cabin seemed to shift subtly in response, shadows stretching, corners darkening. I told myself it was my imagination, that isolation and fatigue were bending my senses. But the symbols, the diary, the air, it was all too deliberate to be mere coincidence. On the table, I noticed something else, a small, rusted key. It was unremarkable, yet the way it had been placed suggested intention. I picked it up carefully, turning it over in my hands. The diary did not mention a lock, but the key felt significant, as if it belonged to a hidden compartment or chest, something the writer had kept close and private. I slid it back into my pocket for now, unsure if I wanted to pursue that thread yet. The symbols, the diary, the quiet pressing air of the cabin, these were enough to occupy my mind, enough to keep me tethered to a sense of unease. I moved toward the window, brushing the glass lightly. The outside was misted and gray, the forest pressing close. The fog wrapped around the cabin like a shroud, hiding what lay beyond, distorting shapes, making everything seem distant and strange. I imagined the writer looking out this same window, day after day, week after week, watching shadows, listening for whispers, trapped by isolation and fear. I could feel their presence, almost like a residual energy clinging to the edges of the room. I returned to the diary, flipping to the last few pages. The entries were short, fragmented, almost like thoughts scribbled in panic. I hear them every night. They never sleep. I cannot rest. I cannot leave. They know, they see. I am alone but never alone. If someone finds this, do not follow, do not enter. Beware the walls, beware the symbols. The writing stopped abruptly, leaving a gap where words should have been. I sat back, the diary trembling slightly in my hands. The silence of the cabin pressed against me, thick and patient. The weight of the words, the symbols, and the presence in the cabin made my chest tighten. I realized I had been holding my breath. The mist outside had thickened, curling under the doorframe, and I could hear faint noises beyond the cabin, perhaps the wind, perhaps something else. I forced myself to take slow, deliberate breaths, grounding myself in the moment. The radio remained in my bag, pulsing faintly with static, tethering me to the outside world. But it offered no answers, only the echo of someone reaching out, someone trapped in memory, someone who had vanished long before I arrived. I stood slowly, placing the diary back on the table with care. The symbols on the walls seemed to shimmer faintly in the light, the edges catching shadows in ways that made them seem alive. The cabin had held its secrets for decades, and perhaps longer. I could feel the weight of them pressing in, as though the walls themselves remembered every whispered fear, every heartbeat of someone who had once called this place home. I stepped toward the door, flashlight sweeping over each symbol one last time, diary clutched lightly under my arm. As I left the cabin, the air outside felt heavier, charged with the history and the isolation that had built up here. The mist swallowed the forest, hiding everything beyond a few feet. The radio crackled faintly in my pack, the voice almost imperceptible, threading through static like a whisper I could barely catch. I walked slowly back along the trail, one step at a time, carrying the diary with me, my mind spinning with the presence of someone who had lived and feared and vanished here, leaving only symbols and words behind. The forest remained silent around me, yet I could feel it pressing closer, as though the weight of all the abandoned cabins, all the whispers, all the traces of life that had been swallowed by time, lingered in the mist. I knew that the diary, the cabin, the symbols, they had more to tell. I knew that the radio would continue to murmur, that the forest would continue to hold its secrets, patient and unwavering. And I also knew that I would return, drawn by the faint pulse of presence, by the whisper of someone reaching across time, by the promise of understanding what had been left behind. I stayed near the trailhead for a while, lingering longer than I should have, unwilling to leave the diary behind, unwilling to step away from the pulse of the radio. The forest pressed close around me, mist curling through the trees like slow-moving smoke. Every step I took on the softened earth sounded louder than it should have, echoing through the thick fog, and I found myself wishing for sound, anything familiar to tether me to reality. The voice on the radio had faded again, but it pulsed faintly, threading through the static like a heartbeat, and I felt compelled to follow it further. As I moved deeper into the forest, the shadows began to shift more noticeably. Not the shadows cast by trees or moonlight, but something subtler, something alive in its darkness. I caught them at the corners of my vision, flickering, stretching, disappearing when I turned my head fully to look. At first, I told myself it was fatigue, my eyes playing tricks in the fog. But the feeling of being watched, of being observed, pressed against me with increasing insistence. I slowed my pace, careful to tread lightly over roots and moss, trying to remain aware of every movement around me. The radio hummed softly in my pack, the static-laced voice faint but persistent. I pressed it closer to my ear, straining to hear any words, any fragment of speech. The voice seemed almost closer than before, as if the source had shifted to somewhere near me. Not just in the ruins of the cabins, but in the very forest around me. I shivered, a cold, creeping dread crawling up my spine. I shook my head, trying to rationalize it. Perhaps someone else was here, another signal broadcasting from a forgotten place, or perhaps it was just the echo of the forest amplifying my imagination. I stopped near a cluster of old pines, the mist thick between their trunks. The ground was soft, waterlogged in places, and the smell of damp earth was sharp. I crouched slightly, focusing on the radio, listening. The voice pulsed again, just a hint of cadence, and I swear I heard a syllable that sounded like my name. My heart skipped. I swallowed hard, telling myself it was impossible. No one should have been this deep in the forest, and yet the feeling of closeness, of urgency, was undeniable. As I moved forward, the shadows became more distinct. They didn't behave like ordinary shadows. They flickered in the mist, sometimes longer than their source, sometimes twisting toward me with an impossible fluidity. I froze several times, heart hammering, flashlight sweeping over empty trunks and thick fog, finding nothing, yet feeling the weight of something watching, waiting, always just at the edge of perception. The radio pulse guided me like a thin lifeline, but the presence in the forest felt patient, almost sentient, waiting for me to acknowledge it. The trail became less clear, obscured by fallen branches and thick moss. I stepped cautiously, my flashlight catching glimpses of shapes that did not belong. A swaying branch where none should move, a patch of moss that seemed to shimmer unnaturally, the faint impression of something crouched just beyond the mist. My breathing grew heavier, but I forced myself to move, step by step, following the subtle tug of the radio, following the thread of someone or something that had been calling across time and distance. I reached another cluster of abandoned cabin foundations. The stones jutted unevenly from the earth, covered in moss and vines, and the remains of timber sprawled across the ground. The air was thick, heavy with decay and the cold weight of fog. I paused near one foundation, noting the shadows that stretched across the remnants of the walls. One flickered differently than the rest, curling in a way that seemed intentional, deliberate. I could feel it in my chest, a pressure that was not physical but almost tangible. I crouched, brushing away leaves from the stone, and felt the energy of the place pressing against me. The radio pulsed again, faint but clearer this time. The static shifted in a way that made me tense, as if the voice were moving closer, threading its way around the trees, the foundations, drawing me toward it. I pressed the radio to my ear, trying to distinguish words. All I could make out was a hiss, a rasp, but it was undeniably human, undeniably alive, and undeniably urgent. I had to keep moving. I had to follow it. Each step felt heavier, but I could not stop. The shadows twisted and flickered with my progress, curling toward me, receding when I looked directly at them. I came across a small clearing, the fog thicker here, the light of the moon barely cutting through. The shadows seemed almost fluid, stretching across the ground and pooling around broken stones. I noticed one particular shadow in the corner of the clearing that did not match any tree or foundation. It flickered in ways that defied logic, elongating, folding, almost as if it were observing me. My chest tightened. The radio pulsed softly, and I realized with a sudden clarity that the voice had led me here intentionally, though for what purpose I could not say. The diary I carried felt heavier in my pack, a weight of presence tied to the shadows and the fog. I imagined the writer of that diary walking these same woods, watching the same flickering corners, feeling the same pressure, trapped between fear and curiosity. I imagined their voice blending with the static on my radio, guiding me like a thin, persistent thread. I shivered, glancing at the shadow again. It seemed closer than ever, almost tangible, and yet when I turned fully toward it, the mist swallowed it, leaving only an empty, ghostly clearing. I moved cautiously toward where I thought the shadow had been, flashlight sweeping over the ground, over roots and fallen leaves. The air grew colder, each breath visible, curling in small clouds that dissolved quickly into the fog. The radio pulsed faintly in my hand, and I could hear the faintest suggestion of a word, here. Or was it just static, shaped by my mind? My pulse raced, and I forced myself to take a slow, deep breath, grounding myself, focusing on observation rather than fear. The clearing seemed to stretch endlessly, the fog thick and impenetrable. Every movement of my flashlight created new flickers, new shadows, each one subtly different from the last. I felt a rhythm to the forest, the pulse of presence intertwined with the static of the radio, guiding me forward, teaching me to notice the smallest details. The way a branch moved, the way moss seemed to shimmer, the way the shadows curved in the corners. The voice had grown patient now, almost intimate, threading through the fog with a quiet insistence. I crouched near one foundation, brushing moss and leaves aside, trying to make sense of the patterns left behind. The symbols in the abandoned cabin flashed through my mind, the scratched marks, the frantic writing in the diary. I could almost imagine them extending into the forest, etched invisibly into the fog and the shadows, forming a map, a guide. My fingers traced the air as if following invisible lines, feeling the pull of something beyond comprehension, the weight of a presence that had waited decades to be noticed. Time seemed suspended. The shadows flickered in corners, always at the edge of perception, and the radio pulsed faintly, a soft, rhythmic heartbeat threading through the mist. I felt both isolated and observed, as if the forest itself were alive, aware of my intrusion. I took slow, deliberate breaths, forcing my mind to remain calm, cataloging every sensation. The chill in the air, the subtle pressure in my chest, the movement of the shadows, the pulse of the radio. Each detail grounded me in reality, even as the forest wove its intangible, creeping dread around me. After what felt like hours, I realized the mist was thinning slightly, revealing more of the forest and the trail ahead. The shadows in the corners remained, lingering at the edges of vision, patient and constant. The radio pulsed softly, guiding me onward, but the voice was quieter now, almost satisfied, almost complete. I could not tell if it was leading me towards safety or deeper into the forest, but I knew I could not stop, not yet. The diary pressed against my side. The symbols in my mind and the shadows curling in the corners reminded me of the weight of history, of presence of someone, or something, waiting to be acknowledged. I stood slowly, brushing off damp leaves, and continued along the trail, aware that the shadows were still there, patient, flickering just beyond perception, waiting for the next step, the next whisper, the next heartbeat to carry the story forward. The mist thinned, the fog lifted slightly, and the static of the radio quieted, leaving me with the subtle, persistent knowledge that the forest, the shadows, and the voice were bound together, and that I was now a part of that connection, whether I wanted to be or not. The first hints of dawn were barely visible when I finally decided to leave the clearing of abandoned cabins. The mist hung low over the forest floor, curling around roots and stones, turning the path into a ghostly labyrinth. My body ached from hours of trudging through mud and brush, from crouching over moss-covered foundations and squinting at symbols in the dim light of my flashlight. Yet I felt compelled to linger just a little longer, as if the forest itself were hesitant to release me, as if the radio pulsing in my pack carried more than a signal. It carried a tether to something I could not yet name. I stepped carefully along the trail, my boots sinking into the soft earth. The forest was quieter than I expected at this hour, the usual morning chorus of birds and insects absent, leaving only the subtle rustle of wind through the misted pines. The radio hummed faintly, static soft now, almost imperceptible. The voice that had guided me for hours, the same voice that had drawn me through fog and ruins, through shadowed corners and forgotten cabins, had begun to fade, retreating into silence as the sun's first pale light filtered through the trees. I felt a pang of unease. Though I was leaving the forest physically, the presence of the voice lingered in my mind, threading into my thoughts with a persistence that I could not escape. I glanced over my shoulder repeatedly, half expecting to see a flicker of shadow, the curl of mist-forming shapes that defied logic. The fog had thinned slightly, yet the forest remained dense, its secrets hidden behind the trunks and undergrowth. My heart still thumped irregularly from the tension of the night, and I had to remind myself to breathe, to move slowly, deliberately, letting the soft pulse of the radio guide me forward even as it dimmed into near silence. The path led me past the last of the cabin foundations. Their outlines were sharper now in the growing light, stones and timbers revealed in soft gray and brown. I stopped for a moment, flashlight in one hand, radio pressed lightly against my chest with the other. I could feel the weight of the abandoned structures pressing in from every side, the history of the forest folding around me, heavy and patient. The diary I carried felt like an anchor, tethering me to the story I had been tracing. The voice, the symbols, the abandoned cabins, all part of a thread I could not yet unravel, a story that might never be complete. The radio pulsed faintly again, just a whisper of static. It was enough to make my stomach tighten, to make me glance around nervously. There was no one here, nothing physically present, yet the sensation of being watched, of being observed, pressed against me. I remembered the diary's warning, the frantic last entries scribbled in uneven handwriting, the sense of being alone, yet never alone, the pressure of unseen presences lingering in the walls, in the shadows, in the mist. I had felt that pressure, seen those shadows, traced those symbols, and now, even as the signal faded, I could not shake it. The forest path began to slope upward slightly, leading toward the edge of the trees. I moved slowly, careful not to disturb the fragile quiet. The mist curled higher, wrapping around my legs, and for a moment I thought I heard a whisper riding on the wind. It was faint, almost imagined, yet unmistakably human in cadence, a soft, half-formed plea that disappeared as quickly as it had arrived. I stopped, listening, heart thumping. The radio was silent now, nothing but faint, residual static left in its circuitry. Yet the memory of the voice lingered, echoing in my mind with the clarity of a real presence. I continued along the trail, each step deliberate. The forest seemed to stretch on endlessly, though I knew that the edge was near. I reminded myself that the voice had been a signal, that it had originated somewhere, guided me through fog and shadows, and now that the dawn approached, it had receded. Yet the whispering sensation, the weight of something just beyond perception, persisted. I felt it in my chest, in the back of my neck, threading into my thoughts, leaving me with a sense of dislocation, of lingering tension that the forest itself refused to release. As I approached the edge of the tree line, the first rays of sunlight began to touch the forest floor, soft gold spilling over moss and roots, over the remnants of the old foundations. The mist seemed to lift reluctantly, curling back toward the deeper forest, leaving me exposed in the early morning light. I could see my truck in the distance, parked along the gravel road, its metal dull and quiet in the gentle illumination. Relief should have come with that sight, but it did not. The weight in the air, the memory of the voice, the lingering shadows, it all pressed in still, subtle, insistent. I reached my truck and set the radio on the hood, watching the weak glow of its screen flicker and fade. The static had diminished to nothing, yet I could not shake the sense that someone or something was still present just beyond perception, threading their whispers through the lingering fog in my mind. I sat in the driver's seat, diary resting on my lap, taking slow, deliberate breaths. The forest behind me seemed to settle, quiet, patient, but the echo of presence had followed me beyond the trees. I thought back over the night, the faint voice guiding me through mist and ruin, the shadows in corners that flickered with impossible movement, the foundations of cabins long claimed by the forest, the symbols etched into the walls of the small, rusted cabin, and the diary that chronicled isolation, fear, and vigilance. Each element had been distinct yet connected, a chain of experience that left me unsettled. I realized that even with the radio silent, the whispers would not leave. They had imprinted themselves in my mind, threading into memory in a way that defied reason or logic. I started the truck, its engine breaking the quiet. The sound was comforting, ordinary, yet I could not stop glancing at the forest, half expecting to see shadows flicker, half expecting movement that should not exist. The fog had thinned, yes, but the forest retained its weight, its patient presence. The diary felt heavy in my hands, a reminder that the story was not complete, that the thread I had followed might stretch indefinitely, beyond comprehension, beyond my understanding. Driving along the gravel road, I realized the sun was rising steadily, bathing the world in soft morning light. The forest seemed less intimidating in this illumination, but the memory of night lingered. The signal had vanished, yes, but the voice, the whispers, the subtle sensation of being observed, they remained. I understood in that quiet, uneasy moment that I had become part of something larger, something persistent, threaded into the remnants of those who had been here long before me. The drive back was slow, deliberate. I kept the radio beside me, though it offered no signal, only silence. I replayed every detail of the night in my mind, tracing the path of the voice, the mist, the flickering shadows, and the abandoned cabins. I realized that the forest had not given up its secrets entirely. It had allowed me a glimpse, a passage guided by whispers, by static, by the weight of unseen presence. And now, though the signal had faded, the forest had claimed a part of my awareness. I could not forget it. I could not unhear the whispers threading through memory. By the time I reached the edge of town, the sun was higher, burning away the last traces of mist. The radio lay silent, powerless, yet I could still hear the echo of the voice in my mind, faint, insistent, patient. I understood that it had never been about a signal alone, but about connection, about presence, about the weight of memory left in the fog, in the ruins, in the rusted walls of abandoned cabins. I felt an unsettling awareness that the forest, the whispers, the history I had uncovered, they would follow me, lingering just beyond the edge of thought, persistent and patient, until I could make sense of them, if that was even possible. I parked the truck, sitting for a long while, watching the town come to life around me. People moved about their routines, oblivious to the forest and the secrets it held. The static was gone. The signal was gone. But the whispers, the subtle, persistent echo of presence, remained in my mind. I realized then that some connections, once made, cannot be broken, and some voices, once heard, never truly leave. I carried that weight with me, fragile yet insistent, a tether to the mist, the shadows, the cabins, and the person or something. that had called out, waiting through static and time. Even now, long after the radio went silent and the forest receded behind me, I can still hear it. A soft, fragmented murmur threading through the edges of memory, impossible to grasp fully, impossible to dismiss, and yet undeniably real. The signal may have vanished, but its presence lingers, patient, subtle, eternal. I had been hiking for most of the morning, moving along a narrow trail that wound up the mountainside, the air crisp and cold, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Sunlight filtered softly through the branches, dappling the forest floor in shifting patterns. The leaves rustled gently in the breeze, and birds called to one another in distant, melodic echoes. It was quiet, peaceful, the kind of isolation that hikers like me seek when we want to escape the constant hum of the world below. The trail had grown less defined over the last mile. Roots and rocks jutted from the soil in uneven patterns, and I had to watch every step carefully to avoid slipping. Yet the difficulty was rewarding. The solitude of the forest deepened, and with each careful footfall, I felt farther from everything I knew. As I moved deeper into the trees, I noticed a small depression in the hillside, almost hidden behind a cluster of firs. At first, I thought it might be nothing more than a shallow dip in the terrain, but as I drew closer, I realized there were wooden beams protruding from the earth, weathered and gray, partially covered in moss and lichen. Curiosity pulled me forward. The beams were arranged in a rough rectangle, like the skeleton of something that had once been built with care. I pushed aside some branches and found a narrow entrance, partially collapsed, leading into what I could only assume was a hidden shelter. The forest swallowed the structure in shadows, the branches and leaves twisting around it like a protective shroud. I crouched and examined it more closely, noting the crude construction. Rough-hewn planks, some rotting, others splintered, but it was still recognizable as a cabin, or at least a place meant to be inhabited at some point. Stepping inside, I was immediately struck by the smell: damp wood, mildew, and the faint tang of decay. The shelter was small, barely enough room for one person to lie down fully, with low ceilings and walls that creaked in protest when I shifted my weight. The floor was covered in layers of pine needles, fallen leaves, and dust. It was clear that no one had used this place for years, yet it retained the faint traces of human habitation. A small rusted stove in one corner, a bundle of frayed blankets tucked against a wall, a few broken tools scattered on the floor. I ran my fingers lightly over the surfaces, careful not to disturb the fragile stillness. The air inside was colder than outside, dampness settling in my lungs with every breath. I felt the quiet press against me, a kind of gentle weight that seemed almost alive. I could hear the leaves outside, the birds, and the distant trickle of water somewhere down the mountain, but the shelter itself seemed to absorb sound, leaving only the soft thrum of my own heartbeat in the stillness. There were signs of neglect, yes, but also signs that someone had once taken care here. The blankets, though rotted and tattered, had been folded neatly at some point. The stove had been placed carefully against the wall, not left haphazardly. A small table, barely more than a plank of wood set on rocks, had scratches and markings that hinted at a routine, a life that had once existed here. I could almost imagine the person who had built this place, sitting quietly in the evening, listening to the wind move through the trees, tending to the fire, feeling the solitude of the mountain in a way that most people never do. As I explored further, the calm of the forest began to shift subtly. The sunlight filtering through the trees outside no longer seemed warm, but instead cast elongated shadows that stretched into the shelter, turning corners into dark pockets that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. The rustle of leaves outside, once soothing, now carried an almost rhythmic quality, like the measured packing of a watchful presence. My imagination began to stir, encouraged by the isolation and the shelter's quiet abandonment. I told myself it was natural to feel the forest differently when alone, that my mind was simply playing tricks. I noticed a small cabinet tucked into the corner, its door hanging on a single rusted hinge. Inside were remnants of the past, A chipped enamel mug, a handful of nails, and a few scraps of paper, yellowed and brittle. One of the papers had faint writing, nearly illegible, but I could make out a date, decades ago, and a few words. Waiting, still waiting. I shivered, more from the cold creeping in through the gaps in the walls than from fear. But I could not shake the thought that the words belonged to someone who had lived here, alone, and had left a fragment of themselves behind. The forest outside remained soft and calm, yet I felt a growing tension in the air, subtle and creeping. The wind shifted through the trees, carrying a sound that was not quite a whisper, not quite the rustle of leaves. I turned my head, scanning the shadows at the edges of the shelter, my flashlight tracing the contours of the walls and floor. For a moment, I imagined movement just beyond the corner of my eye, a figure crouched, watching, patient. I told myself it was my imagination, nothing more, but the sense of being observed lingered, pressing lightly against my mind. I stepped back to the entrance and looked around the small clearing the shelter occupied. The trees surrounded it in an almost protective circle, their roots twisting into the earth as if holding the shelter in place. Beyond the clearing, the mountain slope dropped away sharply, and I could see the faint outline of distant peaks through the thinning mist. It was breathtaking, beautiful, but there was also a hollowness to the view, a sense that the world here was separate from the life I knew, untouched and watchful. Inside, I moved toward the stove, brushing away the layer of dust. The metal was cold and rusted, but I could see the careful work someone had done decades ago, the way it had been placed to provide warmth efficiently in the tiny space. I ran my fingers over the rough surface, imagining the fire that might have once burned there, crackling softly, casting a warm glow against the walls. I could almost hear the imagined sound, faint and comforting, yet tinged with loneliness. As I explored further, I found the remnants of a small bed frame against the far wall. The slats were warped and broken, the mattress long gone, yet the arrangement suggested care. Someone had slept here, taken measures to make themselves comfortable in this hidden place. I traced the edge of the bed with my fingers, noting scratches in the wood, small carvings that hinted at boredom, routine, or perhaps a desire to leave a mark on a world that otherwise ignored this secluded shelter. The shadows in the corners of the shelter seemed to deepen as the day brightened outside. The rustle of leaves became intermittent, carrying a rhythm that my mind could not ignore. I felt the subtle pressure of being watched, not by a person, not in any physical sense, but by the memory of someone who had inhabited this space, by the remnants of their presence in the objects and markings left behind. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the stillness envelop me, imagining the life that had been here, imagining the silence that had grown heavier over the years, absorbing every sound, every thought, every passing creature that entered the forest. When I opened my eyes, the shelter seemed smaller, the shadows more defined, and I realized with a slow, creeping awareness that the calm description I had clung to on the hike had shifted subtly. This place was not only abandoned but suspended in time, held in a state of quiet observation, waiting for someone to notice its details, someone to trace its remnants. I felt the weight of history pressing lightly on my shoulders, the echo of life that had long since vanished. I stayed a while longer, exploring the corners, touching the worn surfaces, imagining the small routines of the person who had hidden here. Yet even as I admired the solitude, I could not ignore the creeping unease, subtle and insistent. It was not fear in the conventional sense, but a deep, lingering awareness of absence, of memory, of being a guest in a space that had once held a life entirely apart from mine. The wind outside shifted again, and I could almost hear the whisper of leaves moving across the forest floor, brushing against the shelter's walls, as if reminding me of the isolation and the weight of time that had settled here. Eventually, I turned toward the entrance. The sun had risen enough to illuminate the path back to the trailhead, and I knew I should continue my hike. Yet the shelter lingered in my mind, its quiet presence threading through my awareness, blending the beauty of the forest with a subtle, almost imperceptible tension. I stepped back into the clearing, feeling the soft crunch of pine needles underfoot, and glanced once more at the small structure hidden in the trees. I walked away slowly, deliberately, casting one last look over my shoulder at the shelter tucked into the hillside, half hidden by branches and mist. The forest resumed its calm rhythm around me, the rustle of leaves, the distant birds, but I carried with me a subtle, lingering unease. Even in the soft light of morning, I could not shake the impression that the shelter was watching, patient, waiting for the next visitor to discover its quiet, suspended history. After leaving the first clearing, I continued along the narrow mountain trail, my boots crunching softly over the layer of pine needles and damp earth. The sunlight had grown warmer, spilling through the gaps between branches, but the forest felt heavier somehow, as if the trees themselves were leaning closer to observe me. The air carried that familiar forest scent, mixed with the faint musk of decay and fallen leaves, and I tried to focus on the simple details: the patterns of moss on the bark, the birds flitting between branches, the wind moving gently through the canopy. I didn't expect to stumble upon another shelter, yet there it was, almost hidden behind a dense thicket of firs. This one was smaller than the first, its roof sagging and partially collapsed. The wooden walls were weathered gray, warped by years of exposure, and as I approached I noticed something that made me pause: a series of scratches, deep and jagged, carved into the surface of the door and the surrounding planks. They were uneven, some long and deliberate, others frantic and shallow, as if made in haste. I stepped closer, trying to make sense of them, tracing the grooves with my fingers. The scratches formed no letters, no words, but there was something undeniably human about them. Someone had been here, someone who had left a trace of their presence in a way that was unsettling. I could almost feel the tension that must have accompanied each mark, the anxiety, the impatience, the fear. The forest around me felt quieter now, as if holding its breath, and I realized that for a moment I could hear only my own heartbeat and the soft whisper of the wind through the pines. I pushed the door lightly. It creaked under the minimal pressure, but it did not yield. I tested it again, pressing my shoulder against the wood, and it shifted just enough to reveal a narrow gap. Inside, the shelter was darker than the first, smaller and more enclosed, the air thick with the scent of mildew and old wood. Sunlight barely penetrated the cracks between the planks, creating long, thin slivers of illumination that stretched across the floor and walls. The interior was simple but showed clear signs of prior habitation. A makeshift bed was tucked into the far corner, flattened and worn, with remnants of straw and old cloth scattered across the floor. A small wooden stool, cracked along the edges, had scratches along its legs and top, echoing the marks on the door. Whoever had been here had left evidence of themselves, their presence lingering in every surface, in every imperfection of the structure. I felt a subtle shiver run through me, though it was not the sudden panic of fear, only a creeping awareness of isolation and human memory. I ran my hand along the walls. The scratches on the door continued onto the interior planks, faintly etched, as if someone had tried to extend the markings inside. I could not tell how long ago they were made, days, months, years, perhaps decades, but the sensation they left behind was immediate. I imagined the person who had made them, desperate, trapped, or perhaps merely recording their presence in a world that had ignored them. The forest outside remained calm, almost indifferent, but the shelter exuded a quiet tension that I could not ignore. The floor was covered in fallen needles and debris, yet there were areas where the wood was worn smooth, suggesting repeated movement. I stepped carefully, mindful not to disturb the patterns of habitation, feeling that each small trace told a story I could not fully grasp. The scratches, the worn floor, the crooked furniture, they were fragments of someone else's life, leaving an impression that was both subtle and persistent. I felt as though the shelter itself was aware of me, acknowledging my presence in the quietest way, through shadow, texture, and scent. I moved toward the far wall, noticing more scratches, fainter this time, almost claw-like, trailing up toward the roof. They were uneven, disorganized, but intentional, deliberate in their own chaotic way. I crouched to examine them, brushing away dust and dirt, and my mind began to fill in the gaps. I imagined someone trapped inside, perhaps isolated for days or weeks, feeling the weight of the forest pressing against the thin walls. The scratches were not just marks, they were a record of tension, a way for someone to assert their existence in a place that would otherwise ignore them completely. The quiet of the forest outside amplified every small sound within the shelter. A branch tapping against the wall, a bird calling faintly from above, the soft creak of the wooden planks beneath my weight. Each noise carried more significance in the enclosed, silent space. I could almost hear the subtle rhythm of footsteps that had once moved along this floor, the small sighs of frustration or relief, the occasional sharp intake of breath when fear or surprise struck. The scratches were a language of experience, a memory left behind in a way that was tactile and visceral. I explored the small room carefully, noticing a wooden box tucked under the bed. Its lid was warped and cracked, but I managed to lift it slowly. Inside were scraps of paper, brittle and yellowed with age, some blank, others with smudged, illegible writing. A small tin cup lay beside the papers, dented and rusted. Each item seemed ordinary in isolation, yet together they formed a picture of someone who had lived in this space, quietly, alone, negotiating the weight of the forest and the isolation it imposed. I could feel the tension in the room subtly shifting as I traced these remnants with my fingers. I paused in the center of the floor, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light. The scratches on the door and walls seemed to ripple in my vision, subtle but undeniable, like the shadows themselves were moving when I wasn't looking directly at them. I tried to dismiss it as fatigue or imagination, but the sensation persisted. It was not sudden, not violent, only a gentle, creeping insistence that something about this shelter had left a mark, not just on the wood, but on the atmosphere itself. The shelter's stillness was almost palpable, pressing lightly against me in the way a remembered presence might. I could imagine someone moving quietly through the room, leaving marks, arranging the few possessions they had, listening to the forest beyond and measuring their solitude. The scratches were echoes of moments I could not witness, impressions of tension and anticipation frozen into the wood. I felt an odd kinship with the person who had left them, a shared sense of isolation and awareness of the world just beyond the shelter's walls. I stepped back toward the door, feeling the tension in the room grow faintly heavier. The forest outside remained quiet, but I was acutely aware of the contrast, the calm of birds and leaves versus the deliberate marks etched into the shelter. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. The space held the memory of its inhabitant, and that memory pressed gently against my mind. I traced the scratches one last time before stepping outside, the soft rustle of needles underfoot grounding me in the present, even as the traces of past tension lingered. Standing in the clearing, I looked back at the shelter. Sunlight touched the roof now, casting long shadows across the mossy ground. The scratches on the door remained visible, silent and patient, hinting at lives and moments that I would never fully understand. I felt a lingering unease, the sort that does not startle but persists quietly in the background, a reminder that the forest holds more than trees and sunlight. There are traces of people, fragments of memory, marks left in moments of tension, all waiting for someone to notice. I resumed my hike, moving carefully along the trail. The scratches, the marks, and the subtle weight of history stayed with me, threading through my thoughts. The forest returned to its familiar rhythm, the rustle of leaves, the distant birds, the wind in the pines. But I knew that the shelter had left a trace on me, as much as I had left a trace there by witnessing it. The calm of the morning was tinged with unease, the subtle tension of human memory interwoven with the quiet life of the forest. Even as the path stretched ahead, I could not shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been waiting, watching, recording their presence in the quietest, most deliberate way. The scratches on the door were not just marks, they were a message, a lingering whisper of attention, isolation, and tension that would remain long after I had left the trees behind. The forest had grown quieter as I continued along the trail, the sunlight fading into pale golden patches through the trees. Every step I took felt heavier, as if the weight of the shelters I had discovered was pressing gently against my mind. I had been thinking about the scratches on the door all morning, tracing them again and again in memory, wondering who had left them and why. There was a subtle rhythm to the markings, a cadence that suggested someone had been moving carefully, with purpose, in that small, hidden space. As I approached the clearing again, I noticed something immediately out of place. The shelter, smaller, cramped, decaying as it was, did not smell of only age and rot anymore. There was an undertone, faint but unmistakable, of something more recent. Wood smoke, subtle, almost imperceptible, mingled with the damp scent of moss and pine. My heart rate picked up slightly, though I told myself it was merely curiosity, or perhaps the forest playing tricks in the quiet. The door was still there, bearing the deep scratches I had seen before, yet something had shifted. A small stone previously lying at the base of the door had been moved, set carefully aside. I crouched to examine it, noting faint scuff marks around the threshold, footprints perhaps, or the dragging of an object. Nothing large, nothing definitive, but enough to suggest that someone, or something, had been inside recently. My mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe another hiker, a lost traveler, or even an animal. But the arrangement felt deliberate, human in its subtlety. I took a deep breath and stepped closer, brushing away loose leaves and pine needles. The air felt heavier now, thicker, charged with a presence I could not see. I pressed the door lightly. It resisted my push at first, but gave with a low groan. The shelter seemed unchanged, the interior dim and quiet, yet I could sense movement in the corners of my vision. It was subtle, shadows stretching differently than before, the faintest impression that the air itself was shifting in response to my presence. Inside, the floor was no longer completely covered in debris. The pine needles and leaves had been scattered or swept aside in places, forming narrow paths that led from the doorway to the far corner where the small bed remained. The blankets, still worn and tattered, had been arranged differently, folded with a care that suggested someone had been here recently. I knelt, running my fingers along the worn surface, noting impressions in the straw and dust. They were light, delicate, almost imperceptible, yet undeniably there, traces of someone moving through the room, arranging their small space with a quiet attentiveness. I tried to ignore the creeping unease building in my chest. It was not fear exactly, but a subtle tension, the kind that whispers at the edge of awareness and refuses to be ignored. The forest outside remained soft and calm, the birds singing faintly, the wind rustling gently through the trees, yet inside the shelter, the past and present seemed to converge. The scratches on the door were no longer only relics of years ago. They were echoed in the subtle disturbances within, suggesting someone had moved with care, perhaps even caution, within this hidden space. The wooden box under the bed caught my eye again. I had opened it before, examined its brittle papers and rusted tin cup, yet now it seemed more significant. The papers were unchanged, still fragile, yellowed with time, yet the tin cup had been moved slightly. I could not explain it, and I did not attempt to. Instead, I let my attention wander, noticing the tiny details. The way the light fell through the narrow gaps in the planks, how the shadows stretched and shifted across the walls, and the subtle echoes of movement, almost too soft to register, brushing against my senses. I moved carefully to the far corner, tracing the edge of the bed and the stool. The scratches on the furniture, the marks along the walls, they all seemed to hum with a presence, a suggestion that someone had been here recently, moving quietly, leaving faint traces like whispers in the air. I could almost hear the sound of careful footsteps, deliberate and soft, crossing the floor, fading just before I could catch them. The sensation of being observed grew, not in a threatening way, but as if the shelter itself was aware of me, acknowledging my intrusion, welcoming me in a muted, patient way. For a long moment, I simply stood in the center of the room, listening. My own breathing was loud in the quiet space, yet I could detect other rhythms, subtle and persistent. The faint creak of a plank in the floor, the whisper of air through a crack in the wall, and beneath it all an impression of someone or something watching from the shadows. It was not visible, not fully present, yet undeniably there. I tried to tell myself it was imagination, fatigue from the hike, or the forest playing tricks in the dim light. Still, I could not dismiss the sensation entirely. I examined the walls, running my hands along the rough wood. The scratches were deep and deliberate, running in irregular patterns, some ending abruptly, others fading into shallow etchings. They suggested tension, presence, frustration, or perhaps merely the act of marking time in isolation. Now, coupled with the subtle disturbances on the floor and furniture, they hinted at a continuity, a thread connecting the past inhabitant with something more recent, someone who had kept the memory of the space alive in quiet, almost invisible ways. I crouched near the doorway, feeling the chill of the air settling in. The forest outside remained calm, the light soft, yet the shelter exuded a presence I could not ignore. It was not malicious, not aggressive, only patient, insistent, lingering. I could feel it pressing against my awareness, leaving impressions on my mind that I could not entirely rationalize. It was as though the shelter itself remembered, and that memory had reached forward to touch me in a subtle, persistent way. I moved toward the small window, tracing the outline with my fingers. The glass was absent, broken or removed long ago, yet the frame retained a faint outline of disturbance. A smudge of dirt, a small scratch along the edge, signs that something had been here recently, looking out, observing, perhaps waiting. The shadows outside seemed to shift slightly, dancing in the breeze, and I felt a pulse of unease, a quiet awareness that I was not alone in the sense I had imagined. Something lingered here, faint, subtle, patient. I stood in the middle of the room, letting my eyes wander over every surface. The bed, the stool, the tin cup, the scratches, they all spoke of a presence beyond memory, one that had extended through time in whispers and subtle movements. I could almost hear the soft exhalation of breath, the quiet settling of someone crouched just beyond perception. It was not threatening, yet it demanded attention, asking me to acknowledge that I had entered a space that was alive in ways I could not fully see or understand. Finally, I turned toward the doorway. The trail awaited me, sunlight spilling through the trees, the air fresh and cold. I took a slow, deliberate step outside, leaving the shelter behind, yet the presence followed me in a subtle, intangible way. The scratches, the faint movements, the echoes of recent habitation, they lingered in my awareness, threading through memory with a persistence that refused to fade. I glanced back once, noting the way shadows clung to the corners, the way the trees seemed to lean closer, patient and silent. As I continued along the trail, the forest resumed its familiar rhythm, the rustle of leaves, the faint call of distant birds, the whisper of wind over branches. Yet I carried the sense of the shelter with me, a subtle tension, a quiet awareness of life and presence that had been there, waiting, patient, observing. It was ambiguous, ungraspable, a thread connecting the past with the present in a way that was both unsettling and undeniable. Even as I walked further from the clearing, I could not shake the sensation that someone, or something, had been here, living quietly, leaving traces just enough to make me aware of their existence. The scratches on the door, the disturbed floor, the careful arrangement of tattered blankets, they were all signs, quiet messages in a forest that seemed otherwise calm. The presence lingered in my mind, patient, subtle, a reminder that some echoes of the past refused to disappear entirely. The forest settled around me like a living blanket. Pine needles rustled softly under the weight of the evening breeze, and the distant hum of insects filled the quiet spaces between the trees. I had set up a small camp near the edge of an abandoned clearing, where a few cabins stood half hidden by years of neglect. Their roofs sagged under the weight of moss, walls bowed, and windows gaped like dark, unblinking eyes. Even in the fading light, they seemed to watch. I built a modest fire in a circle of stones, the flames licking the air and casting a warm, trembling glow across the nearby trunks. Smoke spiraled upward, carrying the familiar scent of burning pine into the crisp evening. Sitting cross-legged on the ground, I felt the calm of the forest around me, the kind of quiet that feels almost protective. Yet, despite the serenity, I couldn't shake the feeling that these cabins held more than just decay. They held stories, forgotten, whispered, and sometimes dangerous. As I poked at the fire with a stick, embers crackling and floating upward, I thought about the locals who spoke of this place in hushed tones. They said hikers occasionally disappeared, that sometimes late at night you could hear footsteps in the woods that didn't belong to anyone, and the wind seemed to carry voices if you listened closely. I pulled my jacket tighter and let the chill settle over me, trying to focus on the warmth of the fire. But my mind wandered, drawn to the edges of those stories, where reality and rumor blurred. I had always loved tales like this. There's a strange comfort in them, especially when told in solitude, under a night sky dappled with stars, with only the fire for company. Tonight, I decided to record my own version, speaking quietly into the small handheld recorder I carried for journaling my hikes. My voice was low, almost a whisper, so it would blend with the calm atmosphere rather than break it. I began with the first story I had heard as a child, one told by an old ranger who had grown up in these mountains. "They say," I murmured softly, "that decades ago a family lived in the cabins scattered across this clearing. Not many know their names now. They disappeared one winter without warning. Some say they left to find firewood and never returned. Others say they were taken by the forest itself. Trees grow thick and dark here, and even sunlight struggles to reach the ground. People who enter these woods often speak of shadows that move just beyond sight, and sometimes voices that call your name." I paused, letting the words linger in the cool night air. The flames flickered, casting elongated shadows across the trees, and the sound of the fire seemed louder in the quiet of the clearing. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped softly and I flinched, though no one was there. My own breathing seemed amplified, and I reminded myself that the forest is full of small sounds, all exaggerated in the dark. The next story came from hikers who had camped here in the last few years. I recounted it slowly, deliberately, feeling each word stretch in the calm of the night. A couple set up camp not far from here. They were seasoned hikers, careful, experienced, but they reported strange things. The sound of someone walking around their tents at night, whispers carried on the wind, and small, shallow scratches on the bark of the surrounding trees. They woke to find their fire had been extinguished, even though they had covered it carefully. They left in the morning and no one knows why, but they never returned to the clearing. I shifted slightly, watching the firelight ripple across the nearest cabin. Its dark windows seemed almost alive, reflecting the flames like eyes, and I felt the familiar unease begin to creep along my spine. There was no one here, not really. And yet the forest has a way of making you doubt, of bending your perception so that ordinary things feel charged with significance. I reminded myself again that this was all stories, tales passed down, fragments of memory and rumor. Yet even as I told the stories, I noticed small details around me. A sudden rustle in the underbrush, the brief flicker of movement near the edge of the clearing. I tried to tell myself it was a deer, perhaps a rabbit, or simply the wind shifting the leaves. Still, I could not ignore the impression of being watched, a subtle, patient awareness that seemed to track my movements without sound or form. The fire popped sharply and I jumped slightly, my heart responding faster than I intended. I laughed quietly, shaking my head at my own nerves. "Even seasoned hikers get spooked," I whispered to the recorder. But beneath the humor, a creeping tension persisted, soft and slow, like water infiltrating stone. The forest seemed to hold its breath, listening as I spoke, absorbing every word, and returning a calm that was almost too perfect, as though the trees themselves were aware of the stories I was telling. I recalled another tale, one less well known, about a ranger who stayed in the area over the summer. He claimed that when night fell, the cabins would sometimes seem to rearrange themselves in subtle ways. A door that was closed in the morning might be slightly ajar by nightfall. A log that had been stacked neatly would be shifted. Nothing violent, Nothing terrifying, but enough to unsettle someone who noticed these details and understood that no one else could have been there. As I spoke, I glanced toward the cabins again. The firelight illuminated rough shapes, the textures of rotting wood, the moss creeping along the walls. I imagined someone living here, silently, patient, perhaps moving without being seen. My hands itched to touch the door, to feel the grooves and scratches that might tell me more, but I stayed seated, letting the stories breathe around me. The tension was subtle, slow, like the forest itself was stretching and waiting for me to react. The final story of the evening came from a local historian. He spoke of footprints that appeared around the cabins after heavy rain, some belonging to humans, some not. He swore he had followed them for miles, and they led nowhere, vanishing as suddenly as they appeared. Some things do not belong to our world, he had said, his voice low and careful. And if you wander too long in these woods at night, you may catch the edges of their attention. I exhaled slowly, letting the words sink into the quiet. The fire was lower now, the embers glowing faintly, and I felt the forest pressing in gently. I was aware of every sound, the distant call of an owl, the faint brush of leaves, the whisper of wind through the trees. Each one seemed magnified, carrying an added weight of possibility. I reminded myself to remain calm, to focus on the warmth of the fire, and on the fact that these were stories, tales, legends, whispers in the dark. But even as I spoke, even as I reminded myself of reason, there was a subtle tension that would not release me. The shadows of the cabin seemed to lean toward the firelight, the windows reflecting shapes that were not quite right. A branch tapped softly against the roof of one structure, and for a brief moment I could have sworn it was deliberate, measured, almost like a signal. My heart beat a little faster, but I spoke into the recorder anyway, letting my voice remain low, calm, measured, letting the rhythm of the words ground me in a deliberate, slow pace. As the evening darkened further, I leaned back against a fallen log, staring into the flames. The forest seemed still again, the kind of stillness that carries a weight in the chest and makes the night feel longer than it truly is. I let myself imagine the lives that had once occupied these cabins, their routines, their quiet frustrations, the small tensions and unease that must have lingered even in days filled with sunlight. And I felt ever so faintly that some trace of those presences remained, watching, patient, waiting to be remembered. Eventually, I lowered my voice, allowing the recorder to capture only the soft crackle of the fire and my steady breathing. I knew I would leave in the morning, continuing along the trail, but I also knew that this clearing, these cabins, and the stories they carried would linger in my mind. The calm evening, the warmth of the fire, and the gentle whisper of wind all combined to form a space where the past felt present, where legend seemed to breathe quietly alongside reality, and where the forest itself seemed alive with observation. I extinguished the fire slowly, stirring the embers until they were just faintly glowing, then covered them with a light layer of dirt. The shadows of the cabins remained, dark and patient, as if acknowledging my departure but not my presence. I lay back on my sleeping pad, pulled my jacket tight, and listened to the night fully. The faint rustle of leaves, the distant calls of birds, and the subtle whispers that might have been nothing, or might have been the forest reminding me of the stories it holds. Even as sleep began to take me, I carried the sense of watching eyes, patient and silent, following me into dreams. The calm of the evening fire had not erased the whispers of the past. It had only illuminated them, gently, patiently, in a way that would linger long after the night ended. The forest had grown darker now, the sun dipping behind the distant peaks and spilling long shadows across the ground. My campfire, though small, cast a circle of light that barely reached the edges of the clearing, leaving the surrounding trees in deep, shifting darkness. I had lingered too long by the fire, speaking softly into my recorder, letting the stories of the abandoned cabins echo in the quiet night. But something urged me to move, to follow the narrow trail that curved deeper into the woods. At first it was subtle, a glint of something among the roots of a pine, a flutter of fabric caught on a branch. I stepped cautiously, boots pressing softly into the mossy earth, careful not to disturb the delicate balance of forest sounds. The air was cool and moist, carrying the faint scent of pine sap and wet leaves with a hint of something else, something metallic or rusted that I could not immediately place. My heart ticked steadily in my chest, an almost imperceptible thrum that seemed to sync with the rhythm of my careful steps. It wasn't long before I found the first sign. A small, tattered piece of nylon caught on a low branch, frayed and wet from dew. It looked like part of a tent, the kind hikers use for a night in the woods. My stomach tightened as I examined it. Whoever had left it here, it wasn't casual. The fabric had been torn in haste, the edges jagged, and faint traces of dirt and mud suggested movement through the underbrush. My imagination began to fill in the blanks. Someone had been here recently, and they had not left by choice. I knelt to inspect the ground nearby. The soft earth held impressions that were nearly erased by time and weather, but they were unmistakable boot prints, shallow and irregular, suggesting someone had moved quickly, perhaps nervously. I traced them with a gloved finger, nodding the direction they led, deeper into the shadows of the forest. The trail was faint, interrupted by roots and rocks, yet persistent enough to follow. A cold unease settled into my chest, quiet and slow, like the shadow of the mountains stretching over the treetops. Further along the trail, I discovered more: fragments of cloth, a broken water bottle, and a torn strap from a backpack. Each item felt deliberate, left behind either in desperation or by accident. I bent down, lifting a small piece of fabric and letting it brush against my fingertips. It was damp, heavy with moisture, and the smell of earth clung to it. The evidence was tangible, physical, yet it was the absence, the missing person, the unseen presence that filled me with tension. The forest remained calm, almost indifferent, but I could feel the weight of history pressing softly against my mind. The trail curved around a fallen tree, and I paused to survey the area. Moonlight, soft and pale, filtered through the canopy, casting thin lines across the undergrowth. Shadows pooled in corners, flickering as branches swayed in the breeze. I could hear my own breathing now, slightly louder than the wind, and the faint crack of twigs beneath my boots. Everything was still and quiet, yet the forest seemed to vibrate with the echo of movement, subtle and persistent, as if it remembered the footsteps of someone who had passed this way recently. Then I saw the tent. It was torn and collapsed, half hidden in a dip of the earth, the fabric shredded and flapping faintly in the wind. The poles were bent and splintered, suggesting someone had left in a hurry or had been forced to leave. I approached slowly, each step measured, careful not to disturb the fragile remains. Inside there was little left, nothing of immediate use, but the ground bore faint depressions, small hollows in the dirt that suggested someone had slept or crouched there. The realization hit me with quiet force. Someone had been here, and they had vanished, leaving only these subtle, haunting traces behind. I crouched beside the tent, running my fingers along the fabric. The smell of wet earth was stronger here, mingling with something else, a faint, coppery scent that made my stomach turn slightly. I tried to imagine what had happened, how someone could disappear from a place like this. The forest was dense but navigable. There were paths, trails, and even the faint echo of sunlight through the trees. Yet the evidence told me that the person or people who had been here had not simply walked away. The trail ended abruptly, leaving a silence that felt deliberate, almost conscious. A subtle sound caught my attention then, soft and irregular, like the shuffle of feet over leaves, distant but close enough to make me freeze. I strained my ears, letting the forest hold its breath with me. It faded quickly, leaving only the whisper of wind through the pines. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to move slowly, deliberately, following the faint trail that wound around the fallen logs and over mossy rocks. Each step was careful, a negotiation with the tension that had settled into my chest. I found more signs: a discarded shoe, muddy and scuffed, and a small notebook, the cover wet and warped but intact. The pages were blank, or nearly so, though the edges were smudged with dirt. It was as if someone had carried it, perhaps intending to write, and then abandoned it in haste. I held it lightly, feeling the weight of absence and the suggestion of movement in the forest. The evidence was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make the hairs along my arms rise. Someone had been here, and the forest had witnessed it. The night deepened and the forest grew colder. Shadows lengthened and pooled in the hollows between the trees. I realized that every sound, every rustle, every snap of a twig was amplified in the stillness, carrying with it an uncanny significance. The path ahead was barely visible, winding through a tangle of roots and undergrowth, yet I pressed on. The trail of signs guided me, each discarded item, each faint footprint, forming a narrative that was incomplete but compelling. Someone had been here, and though I did not see them, the forest allowed me to feel their presence. At one point, I paused to rest against a tree, breathing slowly, trying to calm the unease that had settled into my chest. I looked around, letting my eyes adjust to the low light. The tree stood silently, the wind barely moving the leaves, yet the tension remained subtle and persistent. I felt as if the forest itself was observing, cataloging my movements alongside the remnants of whoever had come before. The night's stillness was not comforting. It amplified the absence, making every discarded item, every faint trace, resonate more strongly than it should. I continued along the trail, now more careful than before. The forest pressed in around me, the canopy thickening, dimming the faint moonlight. My mind replayed the stories I had told by the campfire, weaving them into the evidence I was now observing. Disappearances, abandoned shelters, the whispers of the past, they all merged into a creeping sense of inevitability. The forest had secrets, and it revealed them slowly, through traces that were subtle, patient, and insistent. Eventually, I reached a small clearing where the trail ended abruptly. The ground was disturbed, flattened as if someone had sat or crouched here for hours. Leaves and pine needles were pressed into the dirt, forming an uneven surface. I knelt, tracing the patterns with my fingers. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of what had happened, yet the evidence, the torn tent, the abandoned belongings, the faint tracks, pointed toward an unresolved story. The forest had claimed it, leaving only hints for those who dared to follow. I stood slowly, letting my eyes sweep across the clearing. The night sky, visible through gaps in the canopy, was a deep indigo, and the stars seemed distant, remote, uncaring. The forest remained quiet, but the tension lingered, a subtle echo of presence and absence intertwined. I realized then that this place, these woods, had been inhabited recently, not by the wildlife or the elements, but by a human presence that had vanished without a trace. The ambiguity pressed gently against my mind, leaving me aware, vigilant, and profoundly unsettled. Turning back toward my camp, I retraced my steps carefully, noting every detail of the trail in reverse. The faint footprints, the scraps of fabric, the broken water bottle, the scattered remnants of a life abruptly interrupted. Each item was a fragment of a story I could not fully know, a narrative paused mid-motion. The forest, calm as it seemed, carried these fragments forward in the quiet, allowing me to witness them, to feel the weight of absence and the subtle hint of a presence still nearby. When I finally reached my campfire, the flames were small and steady, the glow familiar and grounding. Yet the unease persisted, a quiet hum beneath the warmth and the soft crackle of burning pine. I settled onto my sleeping pad, eyes occasionally drifting to the tree line, where shadows seemed to gather in quiet anticipation. The night had not revealed the missing person, nor had it provided answers, only hints and traces that would linger in memory long after the morning arrived. As I closed my eyes, the forest seemed to exhale around me, the subtle tension threading through the air like a faint whisper. The signs of a missing person, the abandoned belongings, the torn tent, the faint tracks, remained vivid in my mind, and I realized that the stillness of the night had amplified them, turning absence into presence, silence into a careful, persistent watchfulness. And even as sleep began to pull at my consciousness, I knew the forest had not released me. It had merely let me rest, patient, silent, and aware. I had been following the faint trail all evening, moving slowly and deliberately through the thickening forest when I saw it. The cabin appeared at the edge of a small clearing, almost hidden behind a stand of spruce and pine, yet strangely intact. Unlike the other abandoned structures I had passed earlier, this one looked as though someone had just stepped away, leaving it untouched for only a few hours or days. The wood, weathered but not rotten, gleamed faintly in the moonlight. The windows were dark, but the glass remained unbroken. The door was closed, a simple wooden slab with iron hinges, rusted but functional. I stopped at the edge of the clearing, my heart slowing slightly, though a quiet tension gripped me. There was no sound, no wind, no animal rustling, just the heavy stillness of the forest. And yet the cabin seemed aware. I could feel it, a subtle pull, a sense that the space held something or someone waiting. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. My boots pressed softly into the moss, and I reached the door with careful steps, hands slightly trembling as I rested them against the rough wood. The surface was cold under my fingertips, the texture uneven from age. Scratches marred the lower half, some shallow, some deeper, like small claws or hurried hands seeking purchase. I pressed my ear against the wood, listening. For a long moment there was nothing but my own heartbeat and the distant call of an owl. Then, almost imperceptibly, a faint creak came from inside, as though the cabin itself were exhaling. I stepped back slightly, a shiver crawling down my spine, yet I could not bring myself to leave. Something drew me closer, a quiet insistence that I needed to see what lay inside. I slowly turned the handle, testing it. It moved easily, swinging the door inward with a soft groan that echoed faintly in the still night. The smell hit me immediately, a mix of dust, damp wood, and something more elusive, a faint hint of perfume or soap that suggested life, or at least the remnants of it. I stepped inside, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. The floorboards creaked beneath my weight, but nothing collapsed. The cabin was small, a single room with a rough wooden table in the center, and a few shelves along the walls. What caught my attention first were the personal items. A backpack lay on the floor unzipped, its contents scattered in quiet disarray. A thermos, dented but intact, sat upright beside it. A pair of hiking boots, muddy and worn, were pushed against one wall as if left hastily but deliberately. I recognized some of these items. They matched the fragments I had found along the trail. The realization sank slowly, a heavy, unsettling weight. Whoever had left these behind was here recently. Perhaps they were still here. I approached the table, noticing a notebook lying open, pages curled from moisture but legible in the dim moonlight filtering through the windows. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, yet the words carried an anxious undertone. Lines describing the day's hike, observations about the forest, and quiet reflections on solitude. But then, the tone shifted. The sentences became shorter, fragmented, almost trembling. References to hearing whispers, the feeling of being watched, shadows that moved when no one should have been present. I felt a chill as I read, the slow realization that this person, or someone, had documented the unease I had been feeling myself. I traced a finger along the edge of the notebook, careful not to disturb it too much. The entries ended abruptly, mid-sentence, as if the writer had been interrupted or fled without notice. I glanced around the cabin, my gaze lingering on the corners, the shelves, the small cot pushed against the far wall. Everything seemed ordinary at first, yet nothing here belonged to the forest. It was domestic, human, a sudden intrusion into the quiet wilderness. The contrast made the silence heavier, each shadow more pronounced, each floorboard creak more meaningful. I moved toward the shelves, noting small, personal objects. A water-stained map, a few tin cans, a flashlight with a cracked lens. Nothing overtly sinister, yet the arrangement felt deliberate, staged almost. Someone had been here, present and aware, and had either disappeared quickly or was still nearby, hidden. The subtle signs, the disturbed dust, the slightly ajar cupboard door, the faint footprints in the dirt floor, amplified the tension in my chest. The cabin was alive with absence, each object a marker of someone who had been here and left without explanation. I took a deep breath and stepped closer to the far corner. A small chair faced the wall, overturned slightly. I noticed scratches on the wooden surface, shallow but erratic. Something had scratched at it, perhaps in frustration or desperation. My pulse quickened, yet I kept my movement slow, deliberate. The forest outside was silent, the wind having died down, leaving the night almost unnervingly still. I could feel the weight of the unseen, the suggestion that I was not entirely alone. The thought crossed my mind that the person who had stayed here might have left signs for someone else, warnings, perhaps, or directions. The torn tent, the scattered belongings, the notebook, all hints of a story incomplete, left in fragments for anyone observant enough to notice. My imagination ran wild, but I kept my voice low, narrating softly into the recorder as though speaking aloud might anchor me in reason. "Everything here belonged to someone," I whispered. "Someone who vanished, or perhaps someone hiding, patient, watching." I examined the cot, noticing a faint indentation in the mattress, as if someone had slept here recently. I crouched, letting my eyes trace the floorboards, the walls, and the ceiling. The cabin seemed ordinary, mundane almost, yet the cumulative evidence was undeniable. Someone had been here not long ago, and the signs suggested urgency, perhaps fear. Each item was a piece of the puzzle, yet the final image remained elusive, unresolved. A faint sound made me freeze, a soft tap like fingernails on wood coming from the wall near the door. I held my breath, listening. Nothing followed, only silence. I reminded myself that old cabins creak, that branches tap against walls, that imagination has a way of filling in gaps. Yet the unease persisted, slow and insistent, wrapping itself around my awareness. The personal items, the notebook, the traces of recent activity, they all combined into a quiet, lingering dread that settled in my chest like a weight I could not shake. I decided to leave the cabin, stepping back toward the door with deliberate calm. As I opened it, a faint breeze stirred the edges of the notebook pages, rustling softly in the quiet room. The moonlight highlighted the dust motes floating in the air, and for a brief instant I thought I saw a shadow shift near the corner of the cabin. I blinked, and it was gone. I reminded myself to move slowly, to breathe evenly, and to focus on the path back to the clearing. Yet the tension followed me, subtle and persistent, threading through my thoughts as I stepped out into the cool night air. Outside, the forest was still, though the faint rustle of leaves hinted at movement just beyond sight. I glanced back at the cabin, its dark windows reflecting nothing but moonlight. The signs inside, boots, backpack, notebook, cot, remained silent witnesses to someone's presence. I could not know if that person was gone or merely hidden, but the evidence pressed against my imagination, shaping a story that was incomplete and deeply unsettling. As I made my way back toward the faint trail leading to my camp, I replayed every detail in my mind, recording each one softly in my thoughts and into the small recorder. The forest, calm and patient, seemed to hold its breath alongside me, carrying the tension in subtle waves. I knew I would return to this memory often, piecing together the fragments, wondering if the missing camper had been taken by accident, or if they were still here, patient and watchful, waiting for someone else to notice the signs. The night deepened further, the shadows thickening among the trees, the silence stretching in long, deliberate intervals. I settled back near my extinguished fire, letting the tension recede only slightly, aware that the forest and the cabin had left their mark on me. The personal items, the traces of someone's presence, and the faint suggestion of an unseen watcher lingered in my mind. Even as I closed my eyes, the cabin door remained vivid, a threshold to a story unresolved, a quiet, patient echo in the woods that I could not ignore. The first hints of dawn stretched across the sky like thin washes of pale watercolor, soft and fragile, almost hesitant in the way the sun slowly edged over the ridges of the mountains. The forest, once deep in shadow, began to reveal its muted colors, the dark greens of pine, the brown of moss-strewn trunks, the gray, weathered stones scattered along the undergrowth. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, the chill of the early morning pressing gently against my skin, and I began the walk back toward my camp, retracing the trail that had led me to the cabin. The forest was quieter than usual at this hour. Even the birds were slow to stir, their songs tentative and scattered, but the stillness was not entirely peaceful. There were subtle, almost imperceptible sounds that followed me as I moved. The whisper of dry leaves shifting underfoot, the faint scrape of a branch against a tree, the occasional soft drip of water from dew-laden branches. Each noise was ordinary enough, yet in the context of the cabin, it carried a weight that made my pulse tighten, slow but deliberate. I tried to focus on the path, following the contours of the earth, the gentle slopes, the rocks hidden beneath layers of leaves and moss. The trail wound carefully through the trees, sometimes disappearing under fallen branches or twisting around gnarled roots. Each step required attention, not only to avoid tripping but to absorb the details of the forest, to note anything that might speak of the camper or the strange presence I had felt inside the cabin. The air was damp and heavy, filled with the scent of wet pine and the faint metallic tang that had lingered in the cabin, stubborn and inexplicable. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, not in the overt, menacing sense, but in the quiet, patient way that shadows follow movement, that the forest seems to remember everything it has seen. The personal items I had found, the notebook, the cot, the torn tent, they pressed against my thoughts like echoes. I imagined the camper moving along this very trail, leaving traces behind, moments of hesitation, signs of exhaustion or fear. And yet every fragment of evidence ended abruptly, leaving the story incomplete, unresolved, the forest holding onto its secrets with a patient, unwavering grip. I stopped briefly by a shallow stream that cut across the trail, crouching to cup my hands in the water. It was icy, crisp, and the sensation was grounding, pulling me slightly away from the tension that had wrapped around my chest since I left the cabin. I could see faint reflections of the sky and the treetops, but nothing else. No movement, no hints of another presence. Yet as I drank, I thought I heard it. A faint rustle behind me, so soft that it could have been the wind, or it could have been someone or something, moving quietly through the trees. My pulse quickened. I froze, listening. But only silence followed, save for the gentle trickle of the stream and the distant call of a bird. I resumed walking, each step slow and deliberate, my senses alert to the subtle rhythms of the forest. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of items along the trail that seemed out of place. A fragment of fabric caught on a branch, a bent twig that looked like it had been stepped on, depressions in the earth that suggested weight. Each detail was small, seemingly insignificant, yet in combination with the rest, they formed a story that was fragmentary, incomplete, and deeply unsettling. The camper's path, whatever it had been, ended abruptly, leaving me to navigate the silence alone, aware that absence can be as heavy as presence. The trail twisted and turned, and I found myself moving through a narrow corridor of trees where the light of dawn barely reached. Shadows pooled here, dark and unshaped, and I had to focus carefully to place each foot securely. My mind wandered to the notebook I had seen in the cabin, the abrupt endings, the anxious tone, the hints of fear and vigilance. I felt that same tension now, quiet and persistent, threading through the air like a faint hum beneath the morning stillness. The forest seemed alive with memory, each tree a witness, each fallen branch a mark of someone who had been here before. I tried to remind myself that it was early, that the forest held ordinary sounds and ordinary movements. But the imagination, once primed by absence and ambiguity, has a way of shaping the world around you. Every sound became significant, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the soft brushing of air against bark. I slowed further, stepping lightly, listening for patterns, for anything that might reveal the camper's fate. And yet, no pattern emerged. Only suggestion, only the faintest traces that left the mind unsettled, searching for answers that would not come. At one point, I stopped beside a thick clump of ferns, peering into the shadow beneath their fronds. The ground was undisturbed here, yet I felt a shiver of recognition, as if this spot had witnessed something private, something unseen. I crouched briefly, examining the earth, the roots, the leaves. There was nothing tangible, no footprints, no objects, but the feeling persisted, like an echo of someone's presence that had lingered long after they were gone. I stood again, brushing my hands along my jacket sleeves, trying to ground myself in the rational world, in the morning light, in the familiar shapes of trees and stones. The path opened into a wider clearing, and I allowed myself a small breath of relief. The trees thinned, the sky stretched above me, and the light grew stronger, though still soft and diffused. Yet even here the forest carried the weight of absence. I noticed the faintest traces of footprints that did not match my own, the occasional disturbance in the leaves, the impression of weight where none should have been. My pulse quickened again, subtle but persistent, and I felt the forest pressing softly against my awareness. Someone had been here, perhaps recently, perhaps watching, perhaps gone. I pressed onward, keeping my voice low and calm, narrating my steps as if speaking aloud could tether me to reality. "The trail leads back," I whispered, careful not to startle myself. "But the story does not end. The traces remain, fragments of a life that vanished or was taken or simply dissolved into the forest itself." I forced my mind to consider natural explanations: wind, animals, shadows. Yet even reason could not fully dispel the unease. The subtle, almost imperceptible noises that had followed me, the soft brushing, the faint clicks of distant branches, kept me alert, cautious, aware that the forest had its own rhythm, its own memory. By the time I neared my camp again, the sun had lifted higher, casting long beams of light across the moss and ferns. The warmth was welcome, and yet the tension did not fade entirely. The traces I had followed, the fabric, the torn tent, the footprints, the notebook, the cabin itself, remained vivid in my mind. I realized that the forest had allowed me to witness these fragments, but it had withheld the conclusion. The camper's fate remained unresolved, hanging like a quiet question in the still air, patient and persistent. I returned to my fire, letting it glow faintly in the morning light, and I settled on my sleeping pad to collect my thoughts. The tension had eased slightly, but only enough to let me breathe without conscious effort. I thought of the cabin, the personal items, the faint signs along the trail. Everything was concrete and real, yet unresolved, leaving the mind to wander through possibilities that were never fully satisfying. The forest had given hints, fragments of narrative, but no resolution. It was a quiet, deliberate withholding, patient and subtle. Even as I closed my eyes, the soundscape of the forest continued. The rustle of leaves, the distant bird call, the faint, almost imperceptible brushing of air against branches. And in the silence between, I imagined the camper, where they might have gone, what had happened to them if they had disappeared by accident, by choice, or by some other unknowable force. The morning carried with it clarity of light, but no clarity of understanding. The trail had ended at the cabin, yet the story stretched beyond my perception, leaving only fragments, whispers, and the enduring sense of presence in absence. I let the forest's quiet press against me, letting it cradle the unease, the lingering ambiguity. There were no answers here, no resolution. Only traces, only hints, and the subtle, patient suggestion that the camper's fate, however it had unfolded, remained somewhere in the trees, in the shadows, in the spaces between the whispers and the wind. The long walk back had brought me to safety, but it had not erased the weight of the story, nor the faint, persistent hum of tension that would follow me long after I left this place. I arrived at the logging camp just as the sun dipped below the horizon, its last rays spilling weakly over the tops of the pines. The air was cold, damp, carrying the faint, musty smell of decaying wood and metal. I had been hired as a temporary night security guard, someone to watch over the property while the owners dealt with paperwork in town. From the moment I stepped out of my truck, the camp felt wrong. Not dangerous exactly, but empty in a way that pressed down on the chest, a weight that made every small sound feel amplified. The camp itself was a scatter of old buildings, each one marked by time and neglect. The sawmill stood silent, its rusted blades froze in mid-motion, the smell of sawdust still lingering in the corners of the structure. Cabins, once home to the workers, now leaned slightly, windows broken or boarded, doors creaking faintly in the evening breeze. Piles of abandoned machinery lay scattered across the yard, the skeletal remains of trucks and tractors giving the impression of a place that had simply been left behind, forgotten by both man and nature. I walked slowly across the yard, my boots crunching on the layer of frost and fallen needles. Every step felt loud, too loud, and I imagined the sound echoing through the empty buildings, disturbing the silence that had settled here like dust. I moved from the truck toward the main office, noting how the shadows pooled under the overhangs, dark and heavy. Even the wind was hesitant, whispering softly through the gaps in the buildings, bending the trees but making no real sound. Inside the main office, everything was still. Paperwork lay scattered across desks, some curled and yellowed, others damp from leaks in the roof. A half-empty coffee mug sat abandoned on a counter, dust coating the rim. I ran my fingers over the surface, feeling the chill of disuse. The silence here was profound, thick, almost tactile. Even though I knew no one had been here for days, perhaps weeks, it felt as if someone or something was waiting, patient and unseen, watching from the corners of the room. I settled into a chair behind the desk, my coat still damp from the chill outside. I turned on the small lantern I had brought, the warm circle of light illuminating stacks of log books and outdated forms. Everything was ordinary, mundane, and yet the emptiness of it made my imagination tense, filling in gaps with shapes that might or might not exist. I ran a hand over the old radio, hoping to catch a signal from the town, anything to remind me that the world beyond this camp was still functioning, still ordinary. The static hummed back, low and monotonous, a reminder that the outside existed, but not here, not now. The yard beyond the office was still in my peripheral vision, darkened by the fading night. The idle machinery, the trucks, the loaders, the winches, sat frozen as though paused mid-task. One particular skidder caught my attention, its claw raised slightly, rust covering its joints, yet somehow appearing poised, ready to move at the smallest provocation. I shook my head, trying to banish the feeling that it might spring to life. My mind played tricks in the darkness, casting shadows from the moonlight onto the machines, turning their shapes into something almost human, almost aware. I rose from the chair to do a slow patrol, walking the perimeter of the camp. The path was overgrown, winding between the decaying structures. Each building offered its own kind of quiet dread. The bunkhouse smelled of damp linen and rot. The storage shed was full of the remains of tools left to rust. The old workshop carried the faint, lingering aroma of oil and sawdust, clinging stubbornly to the air. Every doorway, every window seemed to hide something just beyond sight, and I moved cautiously, my steps deliberate, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light. By the time I reached the edge of the property, the forest began to press close, tall pines and firs forming a wall of shadows that blocked any remaining light from the sky. I paused, listening to the silence, nodding the way it was so complete that even my own breathing sounded loud. Somewhere in the distance, a piece of machinery groaned faintly, a chain shifting in a rusted winch, or perhaps just the wind. But in the context of this abandoned place, it sounded deliberate, like a reminder that the camp's work was unfinished, suspended in time. I continued my walk back toward the office, passing under the skeletal frame of the crane that had once lifted logs from the yard. Its metal arm stretched into the sky, dark against the faint stars, creaking gently as the wind brushed past it. I imagined the ghosts of workers here, long gone, shadows cast over this machinery, watching me move through the space they had once inhabited, not in menace but as witnesses. The idea sent a shiver down my spine, slow and deep, settling across my shoulders. Returning inside the office, I made a cup of instant coffee, the boiling water breaking the quiet for just a moment. I sipped slowly, letting the warmth fill me, and I looked around the room, noting the small details, the peeling paint, the dusty ledgers, the cracked window overlooking the yard. The machinery beyond was still, silent as tombstones. Yet I felt it, the subtle tension that hung over the camp, like an unspoken promise of events yet to unfold, or memories trapped in the wood and metal, lingering long after the workers had left. I set the cup down and turned back to the radio, fiddling with the dials. Static hissed, and for a long moment I thought I heard a voice beneath the hum, faint and distant, as if the air itself carried whispers. My pulse quickened, but I told myself it was nothing more than interference, an echo of my own imagination. Still, I paused, letting the silence press against me again, noting how the shadows in the corners of the office seemed darker, heavier, almost pooling with awareness. As the night deepened, the quiet outside became almost oppressive. I walked to the window and looked across the yard once more. The idle machinery gleamed faintly under the moonlight, a ghostly sheen over rusted steel. The cabins beyond seemed to lean closer, as if drawn in by the stillness. I thought about the people who had worked here, the long days moving timber, the quiet evenings after their labor, and how quickly all that life had been withdrawn. The camp was a skeleton of its former self, and yet the residue remained, a palpable energy that made the silence heavy, meaningful. I spent the rest of the night patrolling slowly, moving through the office out to the yard, along the edge of the forest. Each step, each shift of my weight was measured, careful. I kept my voice low, narrating softly into my own thoughts, reminding myself that the world beyond this place still existed, even if it was faint and distant. The machinery, the buildings, the forest, all seemed to pulse with memory, holding fragments of events, conversations, work, and exhaustion, suspended in the dim light of the moon. By the first hints of dawn, I returned to the office again, letting myself sink into the chair behind the desk. My legs ached from walking, my mind buzzing quietly from the tension of the night. I looked around, observing every detail again. The idle machines, the broken windows, the desks with papers scattered across them. The camp was silent, yes, but it was not empty. It was full of the echoes of life, careful and deliberate, patient and unwavering. And I knew that I would carry that quiet awareness with me long after my shift ended, long after I left the gates behind. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the cracks in the walls, painting the dust in gold. The machines gleamed faintly, almost alive in the early light. The cabins held their shadows, patient, quiet, observing. And in that calm, heavy stillness, I felt the camp watching me as much as I watched it, the memory of work and labor and life lingering, waiting. The night had been long, but in truth, it was only the beginning of the story the camp had to tell. Night fell deeper than I had expected, heavier than the sky alone could explain. I had lit the lantern in the office, a soft, golden glow that pooled across the walls and desks, illuminating the dust motes dancing lazily in the still air. Outside, the yard had become a tangle of shadows, machinery and cabins melting together into forms that were not quite solid, shapes that the imagination could twist into something else. I kept reminding myself to breathe slowly, to focus on the tangible, but the longer I sat in that fragile light, the more the camp seemed to lean in around me, listening. The first subtle change was almost imperceptible, a flicker of the lantern's flame, just a quick wink, as if the air itself had exhaled. I froze mid-breath, waiting. The warmth of the lamp seemed to shrink slightly, as though drawing back from something approaching. I told myself it was nothing, just a draft slipping in through a crack in the window, or a shift of air from the old vent. Yet deep down, I felt a cautious awareness that this place did not behave like other places I had known. Even when empty, it had a pulse, a rhythm that did not follow ordinary rules. I walked slowly across the office, the wooden floor groaning softly under my weight. Each step was deliberate, measured, an attempt to assert control over the growing tension. The lantern's light swung gently in my hand, casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. For a moment, a shadow seemed to detach from a chair, stretch thinly across the floor, and then vanish as I moved closer. I stopped and held my breath, listening. Only the soft hum of the lamp and the settling of the old building responded, yet the impression remained, lingering in the corners of my mind. The office door had started to rattle faintly, like the hinge was shifting with a sigh. I approached slowly, hand brushing against the rough wood. The sound stopped abruptly as I touched it, leaving only silence and the faint hum of the lantern. I reminded myself again. The camp was old, wood settles, metal contracts, floors creak. But reasoning did little to quiet the feeling that I was not alone, that there were echoes in the air left by others who had once moved through these spaces, or perhaps by something that never left at all. I returned to my patrol, moving down the narrow hall toward the storage rooms. The flickering light made everything seem alive, the shadows of crates and tools stretching and shrinking, twisting into shapes that felt vaguely familiar yet entirely wrong. I imagined the workers who had once walked these halls, their boots on the boards, the sound of chains dragging logs, voices raised in instruction or laughter. And then I remembered the silence that had greeted me here. It was too absolute, too precise, as if the camp had been waiting for someone else to step inside, and now it had found me. A faint whisper reached my ears, soft like the brush of air over my skin. I paused, heart rate steady but alert. My first thought was wind again, but the whisper carried rhythm, the suggestion of syllables just beyond comprehension. I strained to listen, but the sound vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only the faint scent of sawdust and metal. I took a breath, steadying myself, and reminded myself that imagination, when fed by fear, can generate the most convincing illusions. Still, I could not shake the impression that someone, or something, was moving just beyond the glow of the lantern, watching with patience. I moved into the storage rooms, the lantern held high to illuminate the stacked crates, old tools, and coils of rope. The air was colder here, dense with the smell of oil and rot. Shadows clung to the corners, pooling like ink. I noted small details, the tilt of a crate, the bend of a rope, the angle of a broom against the wall. Nothing had moved since my last pass, yet the arrangement of objects seemed slightly different, as if they had shifted imperceptibly. I shook my head, telling myself it was exhaustion or the angle of the light, but the skin on my neck tingled with awareness, the instinctive knowledge that something was not quite as it should be. The lantern flickered again once, twice, and I caught the brief glint of something reflecting in the metal of a hook on the wall. I squinted, and for a moment it looked like a figure standing just beyond the light, pale and featureless. My pulse quickened, slow and deliberate, a creeping heat under my ribs. I took a step forward and the figure vanished. Only the crates remained, unchanged, silent, unmoving. My hand tightened around the lantern, the warmth of the metal grounding me in reality, reminding me that the forest and camp beyond had not yet claimed me. I moved toward the back of the storage area, where a small window let in the faintest hint of moonlight. Outside, the yard was a shadowed maze, the machinery looming like sentinels. The trees beyond stirred in the wind, the branches scratching against each other in a soft, almost conspiratorial rhythm. I felt a shiver pass through me, not from cold, but from the awareness that the night held a history here that I could not see fully, only sense. Every object, every shadow, seemed to carry residue, fragments of events long past, echoes of human presence that clung to the walls and floors. Back in the office, I set the lantern on the desk and paused to drink from my thermos. The liquid was hot and it grounded me, yet it did nothing to ease the creeping tension that had begun to settle like a second layer of skin. I listened carefully, the soft creak of a chair settling, the faint scratching of metal against wood in the distance, the almost imperceptible whisper of air moving through broken window panes. I reminded myself, everything has an explanation. The human mind fills silence with story. But even as I spoke these reassurances aloud, my voice sounded oddly distant, swallowed slightly by the thick air of the room. Hours passed, or so it seemed. I moved through the office and storage area in a slow, deliberate loop, keeping the lantern high, scanning the shadows. I began to notice patterns, the way the flicker of the flame seemed to animate objects, making them breathe, shift, grow. The whispers, if they were real, were sporadic, faint, and always just out of reach. I stopped trusting my own memory of sound, relying on what I could see, though even that was uncertain. The shadows had their own movement, independent of the wind, independent of the lantern, and it was impossible to know if I was witnessing reality, or the camp's long, patient trick on those who dared linger too long. Toward the small hours, the tension built slowly, almost imperceptibly, like water filling a vessel too large to notice at first. Each shadow seemed to lean closer. The whispers became a low, rhythmic undertone synchronized to my heartbeat. I did not feel fear in the sudden, explosive sense of panic, but as a creeping, deliberate awareness, slow and insistent, that I was alone but not alone. watched yet unseen. The lantern wavered, its glow barely brushing the corners of the office, and I imagined the shapes beyond, forms of rusted machinery, leaning buildings, and forgotten tools, all aligning in some silent, patient observation. By the time the first hints of dawn crept across the horizon, my patrol was complete. I had moved through every room, every shadowed corner, every stack of crates. The whispers had faded, the flickering had slowed, but the sensation remained. The camp had a memory, a presence that was patient and undemanding, observing my every motion. I sat in the chair behind the desk, exhausted but alert, and allowed my eyes to rest on the yard beyond. The machines gleamed faintly, caught in the soft light of morning. The buildings leaned against one another like weary old men. The night had passed, but the weight of it lingered, subtle and insistent, like a pulse beneath the ordinary world. Even as I sipped cold coffee, I knew that the lantern would flicker again. The shadows would shift, the whispers would return, and the camp, patient and deliberate, would continue to watch, waiting for the next movement, the next sound, the next intruder in its silent, preserved world. The first light of dawn crept cautiously through the trees, thin slivers of pale gold that barely touched the ground. I stood at the edge of the yard, the old office behind me silent, the machines frozen as though waiting for someone to give them life again. The night had been long, and even though nothing had attacked, nothing had moved in ways I could confirm, I felt every second of it in my bones. The camp was awake, but not alive in the way I knew life. It existed in a suspended rhythm, a heartbeat I could sense but could not touch. The forest beyond the clearing was a wall of shadow and green, branches brushing together, leaves whispering against one another. The air carried the smell of damp earth and pine resin, sharp and clean compared to the mustiness inside the office. As I walked toward my truck, I scanned the yard, the frozen machinery, the skeletal buildings. My eyes lingered on a rusted loader, its cloth slightly lifted. For a fraction of a second, I swore it had moved since the night, repositioned ever so slightly, as if aware I was looking. I shook my head and stepped forward, telling myself it was impossible. Still, that nagging tension remained, the feeling that the camp had its own memory and that memory had observed me. I paused near the edge of the yard where the shadows of cabins stretched long with the rising sun. Something caught my eye, a boot print in the frost. It was faint, pressed into the dirt that had thawed just enough overnight and not quite mine. I stared at it, breath catching in my throat. The print was small, precise, and led toward the woods before disappearing into the brush. My mind raced with explanations: a deer, a fox, a lost hiker. Yet instinctively I felt the print was different. It carried intention, a deliberate path through the yard. I knelt to examine it, noting the depth, the spacing, the angle, and a cold shiver ran along my spine. Something had been here. Something had moved among the shadows while I patrolled, careful, unseen. I moved slowly toward the office, checking doors and windows as I passed. Nothing had changed there, or so it seemed. The lantern I had left behind the night before still rested on the desk, flickerless in the morning light. Dust settled across its base, but I could not shake the memory of its subtle movements during the night. The whispers, the flickers, the shadows that seemed almost animate. They had left a mark, not physical but lingering in perception. I realized, suddenly, that the camp would not release me from that awareness simply because the sun had risen. Inside, the office was quiet, the air thick with the smell of old paper and dust. I ran my hand along the desk, noting how the surfaces held a cool residue, a faint impression of fingerprints that were not mine. I frowned, unsure whether I had imagined them in the dark or if they had been left by someone or something else. My pulse quickened slightly, a slow, steady rhythm echoing the night's tension. I reminded myself that the camp had history, workers, foremen, visitors. All could have left traces, subtle, easily overlooked. And yet this felt different, a presence that had not been human or not entirely. Stepping back outside, I walked slowly across the yard, boots crunching on the thawing frost. I examined the machinery, each piece now illuminated by morning light, yet the sense of awareness persisted. The skidder, the loader, the crane. They seemed to occupy the yard differently in daylight, less threatening but not less present. I tried to recall the night, the shadows that had shifted independently of the lantern, the whispers that had come and gone like breathing just beyond my hearing. My mind insisted they were illusions, yet the residue, the prints, the impressions, the subtle anomalies, remained. I approached the edge of the forest, where the shadowed underbrush met the clearing. Something moved just beyond the tree line, small, deliberate, careful. I froze. My first thought was a deer, but it was too deliberate, the movement precise. I strained to see through the morning haze, heart settling into a slow, tense rhythm. The movement stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving nothing but the whisper of leaves in the breeze. I could not tell if I had imagined it, or if something had truly been observing me, just as I had observed the camp all night. The sense of being watched was not fear in the traditional sense. It was the realization that awareness existed without form, without confirmation. I moved carefully toward the truck, glancing back at the camp, noting the tilt of the cabins, the frozen machinery, the way the light pooled unevenly across the yard. Even the sunlight seemed hesitant, brushing over objects lightly, as if respecting some invisible rule, some unspoken history that I had not yet earned the right to witness fully. The camp had its own patience, its own rhythm, and I was merely a temporary participant. As I climbed into the truck, I looked back one last time. The office sat solid, windows catching the light, lantern cold and inert. The cabins leaned into the day, shadows retreating slightly. But the evidence remained, the boot print in the frost, the impression in the dust, the residue of the whispers and flickers. The camp had left a mark on me, subtle and unrelenting, a memory of night that daylight could not erase. I knew I would carry it with me, that it would resurface in quiet moments, when the wind shifted just right or a shadow lingered too long in a familiar space. The drive away from the camp was slow, my hands gripping the wheel, eyes flicking repeatedly to the rearview mirror. The forest swallowed the yard behind me, and the fatting outline of machinery and buildings gradually disappeared into the morning haze. Yet the presence, the sense of observation, the lingering memory of the night, remained with me, coiled quietly in my mind. I tried to shake it, reason it away, yet it persisted, subtle, patient, insistent. Even now, writing these words hours later, I feel the echo of that night pressing through the calm of my apartment. I can recall the flicker of the lantern, the whisper of movement just beyond my vision, the deliberate trace of boots in the frost. The camp was empty, yet it had not been. It holds its history, its memory, its presence, in a way that is tangible even now, distant but impossible to ignore. I do not know what or who was in the camp that night. Perhaps it was the memory of the workers, the echo of days and nights past. Perhaps something else, something patient, deliberate, waiting for the next visitor to step into its rhythm. Whatever it was, it left evidence, not in forms I could catch or hold, but in the subtle, lingering awareness that I was not alone, that the night was not entirely empty. The sunlight has filled the forest now, warm and solid, yet the impressions remain. I will return, eventually, drawn by a need to understand, to observe, and perhaps to confirm what is only suggested by shadows and whispers. The camp is quiet now, silent in the glare of day, but I know that it waits. And when night falls again, the lantern will flicker, the whispers will rise, and the awareness will return, patient and unyielding. For now, I drive slowly, leaving the yard behind, yet carrying it in my mind. The machines, the cabins, the shadows, have marked me with something subtle but permanent. And even as sunlight paints the forest gold, I know the night waits, and the memory of it will not fade.